list of cases over 6 months to the board, and they picked 12 cases, and then you gathered up 10 and went to Chicago and had an oral examination based on those cases. And if you passed the oral examination, then you were board certified.
And your board certification is in what?
Orthopedic surgery.
What is a certificate of added qualification?
So in the event that you elect to do a fellowship and subspecialize, hand surgery is one of the specialties that you can apply for a certificate of added qualification. And so once I was board certified, I practiced for an additional year or two, had to resubmit a list of cases and take a written examination to become certified in hand surgery.
Do you teach other surgeons how to do hand surgery?
Occasionally, on occasion, yes.
When was the last time you did so?
Day before yesterday.
Tell the jury about that.
I was, over the weekend, I went to Miami to serve as faculty for a course, a bioskills course we call it, on shoulder and wrist surgery. And surgeons come in and we have case presentations and panels, and then they had a cadaver lab, and we were able to allow them to perform the surgery in cadavers to become familiar with the equipment.
Have you published in your field?
I have.
In peer-reviewed literature?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, we'd like to offer Dr. Moore as an expert in the field of orthopedic surgery, and specifically hand surgery and injuries to the hand.
All right, any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
So moved. Yes, sir.
Dr. Moore, now we get to talk about this case. At our request, what have you reviewed? Just general categories of information have you reviewed at our request in this case?
So a tremendous amount of material. I reviewed the video deposition and trial testimony of Mr. Depp regarding the injury, the medical records from Australia, the photographs of the injury from Australia and Los Angeles, texts and emails, the deposition of Dr. Kipper, and I'm sure there's more.
And when you reviewed the deposition of Mr. Depp, was that just in paper form?
It was a video deposition.
And so what did you review of that deposition?
The section where he describes the injury.
And did you see a video of him describing it?
I did.
And you watched the testimony from this trial of him describing it?
Yes.
And you mentioned that you reviewed some texts as well. What are those?
There were communications amongst Mr. Depp and his physician and others.
And what did you specifically review in those texts relating to the finger injury?
Well, with relation to the finger, there was a text where he had stated he cut his finger off.
Now, Dr. Moore, I'm going to ask you some questions about this case regarding the opinions that you formed relating to Mr. Depp's finger injury. When I ask you those questions, do you agree to answer my questions to a reasonable degree of medical probability?
Yes.
And do you agree to advise the jury and the court if you are not answering any of them to a reasonable degree of medical probability?
Yes.
Dr. Moore, based on your analysis, did Mr. Depp's finger injury happen as a result of a vodka bottle being thrown at him?
Objection leading.
Overruled.
I'm sorry.
No.
And what is the basis for that opinion?
Well, the medical data is inconclusive. It's not consistent with what we see in the described injury pattern or in the clinical photographs. And there are several elements. There's the description was of the hand being flat on a bar and the bottle crushing the finger from the top. But looking at the images, there's really no significant injury to the dorsum of the finger, and to create the type of injury with that type of a crush injury, we would anticipate both injury to the fingernail and other parts of the finger. Can
I stop you there and just
Sure.
just break down a few things? you said the hand resting flat on the bar. Can you show the jury what direction the hand was resting based on the documents you've reviewed?
I think that the demonstration was with the hand flat, like this, across and maybe even curled over the edge of the bar like this.
Which side was facing upward? Which side of the hand?
The back of the hand, or we call it the dorsal surface of the hand, was up.
Doctor, if you could get closer to the microphone,
Oh,
I'd just appreciate it.
sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. So you referred to the back of the hand as the dorsal side of the hand, is that right?
That's correct.
Sort of like the dorsal fin on a shark?
Correct.
Fair. And what is the other side of the hand called?
The palmar surface.
Palmar? Okay. So what direction was Mr. Depp's hand resting on the bar?
So the dorsal side was up, which with the descripted mechanism of injury or the injury, the bottle would have struck the top of the finger at the fingernail.
And you also mentioned a term that I'd like you to explain to the jury, crush injury, please.
So with review of the images and the x-rays, I mean, this was a crush injury. That would generate the findings clinically on x-ray that we saw. The fracture is a we call it comminuted, and the tip of the finger is in multiple splinters, so there are multiple fragments, and typically you see that with a crush type injury.
So a comminuted fracture is one where there's multiple fragments of bone.
That's correct.
And what was the basis, other than what you've read and heard, but from the pictures, what was the basis of your opinion that the hand was resting palmar side down?
Well, that was the way the injury was described and demonstrated in the videos, and so in that position, were the bottle to strike the finger the way it was described, it would have struck on the nail, and the nail was really not injured, and so that's not consistent with that pattern of injury.
Michelle, could I get you to pull up exhibit DX 369, page 26? Your Honor, this is admitted. Ask for permission to publish.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Moore, is this one of the images that you reviewed?
Yes.
Tell us, in relation to your expert opinion on the cause of Mr. Depp's injury, tell us what you see in this picture, please.
So this is it looks like an avulsion type injury where tissue's actually pulled or pinched away. I think what's important in this picture is that the tissue loss is on the palmar aspect from underneath the finger rather than all transversely in the finger, which you would anticipate if the bottle struck the finger. You would expect more of this level of injury rather than isolated to the palmar aspect.
And what do you notice about the condition of the fingernail in this picture?
So from this image, the fingernail appears to be intact. You can't necessarily see the entire nail, but there are other images that have a better profile of that. And the nail's not elevated. There's no subungual hematoma beneath it, or there's no bruise underneath it. Anyone that's ever stuck their finger in a drawer or caught it in a car door or hit it with a hammer knows that almost immediately there's typically bleeding underneath the nail, which creates this hematoma.
So, not being a doctor, I'm going to try to summarize what you just said. Are you saying that in an injury like this, if something had come from the top, that there would be an immediate impact to the fingernail bed?
That's correct.
Michelle, could you please pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 144? Your Honor, this has been admitted as well.
All right. Thank you.
Dr. Moore, I believe you mentioned just a few minutes ago that there were other pictures that showed more of the nail. Is this one of those pictures?
Yes.
And explain to the jury, again, and I'm sorry for the graphic nature of this photo, but it's important that the jury understands the basis for your opinion that a bottle couldn't have caused this coming in from above.
Yeah, again, the mechanism described would have almost certainly led to severe nail injury. I see no subungual hematoma. Again, it's a palmar tissue loss, and the loss is from distal to proximal, which is from the tip back far below the nail. And so for it to create that tissue loss down there would almost certainly have to be injury dorsally with that described mechanism.
So what you're saying is that something coming from the top could not have left the nail intact and yet caused injury from the tip of the finger underneath the nail.
Objection leading.
Overruled.
You can answer.
So I believe that with the mechanism described, that if the bottle struck the nail, there would have certainly been an injury to the nail bed, and in order for the soft tissue injury to be created by that mechanism, there would have almost certainly been tissue loss on the top of the finger as well.
Does Mr. Depp's description of what happened line up with the undisputed photographic evidence that you've reviewed?
No.
Now, we mentioned the term crush injury a few minutes ago. I'd like to show you DX360, please. And, Your Honor, this is, we won't publish this at this time. Is this a document that you reviewed in connection with your expert opinion in this case?
Yes.
And, Michelle, if you can please go to pages, I believe they're 5 and 6. Your Honor, I'd ask for permission to publish these as a demonstrative to the jury.
Just page 5 and 6.
Sorry, 09 and 10.
Page
2
09
pages.
and 10. Could you go to 10 also, so plaintiff can see it? Okay, any objection to 09?
No objection, Your Honor.
Okay, 09 or 10 can be published.
Dr. Moore, what are these pictures of?
So these are x-rays of the injured digit.
And what do you observe in these x-rays? Explain to the jury what you see.
So these are two views. So one in the plane looking through the finger in this direction, one in the plane looking through the finger sideways. And you can see that the tuft or the tip of the finger, the last bone in the finger called the distal phalanx, is shattered. You can see there's multiple little spicules of bone. And there's also a transverse fracture at that level, which runs through the bone. So this is what we would describe as a comminuted fracture, and it's commonly associated with crush injury.
In your decades of practice, Dr. Moore, have you ever seen a comminuted fracture like this result from an object thrown in the way that Mr. Depp described?
Well, not with the constellation of findings shown on the x-rays. I mean, I think that could create a fracture, but in this setting, it wouldn't create a fracture without the associated other injuries that we would anticipate.
And in your decades of practice, when you see a comminuted fracture like this, what are some things that have typically caused it?
So crush mechanisms could be slammed in a drawer, caught between two logs in the fireplace, car door, sliding glass door. Those are all any mechanism that squeezes the finger between two hard opposing surfaces could create this type of injury.
In the statements of Mr. Depp that you reviewed, how did he describe what happened to the alleged bottle when it hit the bar?
I believe he said it exploded, shattered.
If a bottle had exploded near his finger in the way that he alleges, what would you expect to see in the documents that you have reviewed?
Well, I think that the physicians did a good job of documenting the presentation, the appearance of the wound. They did not document the presence of any glass shards, and there were no other associated injuries elsewhere on the hand.
Okay. And I just want to step back for 1 minute. Michelle, can you pull up the next page of the x-ray here? Thank you. And Dr. Moore, just before we move on from x-rays, I know that this, when it's blown up like this, it's a little bit blurry, but can you point out or describe to the jury where the multiple bone fragments are in the finger?
So they're in the very tip. If you see the joint, and then there's what we call the transverse fracture, which is across the middle of the bone in the same plane as the joint, and then the multiple fragments are in the tuft. With a Xerox copy, the quality is not as detailed as a true X-ray.
You can take that down, please, Michelle. Thank you. So back to the glass. In the records that you reviewed, Dr. Moore, did you see any adjacent injuries? In other words, injuries to any other part of Mr. Depp's hand other than the tip of his middle finger?
No.
And is that observation consistent with the explosion of glass type phenomenon that Mr. Depp alleges?
Well, I think in the setting of a glass explosion like that, where there's multiple fragments and the tip of the finger's cut off, you would anticipate that there would be other lacerations.
Did you review the documentation in the medical records from the hospital in Australia?
Yes.
Did any of those providers report retrieving glass from the wound?
No.
What about any glass near the site of the injury?
No.
What about any glass in other parts of the hand?
No.
What about any glass in any of the other fingers?
No.
Is there any reference at all, Dr. Moore, that you've seen to any glass in the records that you've reviewed?
No.
And Dr. Moore, in your decades of practice, have you ever seen an injury associated with a glass explosion that was focused on the end of a single finger in the way Mr. Depp describes?
Well, not consistent with the clinical images and the findings in this case, no.
Have you ever seen an injury associated with an alleged glass explosion where no other glass was found on any part of the patient's body or clothing or anything?
No.
And because there's been talk of a glass explosion, Dr. Moore, there's seems to have been a suggestion that somehow glass may have sliced off the end of Mr. Depp's finger. Is that what's going on here?
No, this wound doesn't really appear to be a sharp glass laceration.
You referred earlier to an avulsion, which is a term I had never heard before. Your opinion in this case. Explain to the jury what that is, please.
So often with crush injuries and we'll see tissue loss that we call an avulsion, or where the tissue's actually pinched or pulled away rather than sliced or cut. It's not uncommon with crush injuries to see that.
In your decades of practice, Dr. Moore, have you ever seen an avulsion injury with a partial amputation that results from an object thrown from the top of the finger in the way that Mr. Depp describes?
No. Again, I think that the description differs from the clinical appearance on the images.
Michelle, can you please pull up Exhibit 369 at page 12? This has been admitted, Your Honor.
All right. We publish to the jury.
Dr. Moore, you said you've treated thousands of hand injuries over the course of your career, correct?
Correct.
What is that on Mr. Depp's hand?
So we describe that as a...
Objection, calls for speculation.
The picture just changed.
Sorry, page 12, please.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. What is that on Mr. Depp's hand?
So that's a plaster
I'm sorry.
splint.
Overruled the objection.
Okay, sorry, thank you. I'm sorry, please tell the jury what that is on Mr. Depp's hand.
So that's a plaster splint. A half a cast is how I sometimes describe it to patients, and it provides stability for comfort and to protect fractures in the course of treatment.
Is that plaster splint hard or soft?
What's plaster Paris? It hardens like a cast does.
Dr. Moore, does Mr. Depp's description of how his finger became injured line up with the facts that you've seen?
No.
I have no further questions.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Cross-examination.
Good morning, Dr. Moore.
Good morning.
You said you reviewed Mr. Depp's video deposition, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you said you reviewed Mr. Depp's testimony at this trial, correct?
That's correct.
And was that also a video of his testimony?
Yes.
And you testified that Mr. Depp demonstrated that his hand was flat on a surface, is that correct?
That's correct.
That's not entirely accurate, is it, though?
No, his description was relatively consistent in both, including turning and resting the hand on the edge.
Isn't it true, Dr. Moore, that when Mr. Depp did the demonstration in his deposition, he showed that his fingers were hanging over the bar?
Well, even hanging over the bar, it still leaves the dorsum of the hand or the nail vulnerable.
That's not my question, Dr. Moore. My question is, isn't it true that Mr. Depp said his fingers were not laying flat on a table, they were hanging over the bar?
Yes.
Okay. And in fact, you knew that when you made that opinion. Isn't that correct?
Well, I believe that as I demonstrated sitting here, that I said that he had said they were slightly curled over, I think was the description that I gave.
Your description in this courtroom was that it was laying flat, and I think you've done that now twice. But in your deposition, you testified that his fingers were actually hanging over the bar. Isn't that correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Misstates the witness's testimony. He clearly indicated they were curled. Or could have been curled.
Overruled.
So that's a distinction that perhaps I misstated in one of the two descriptions. However, that does not substantially change my opinion of the impact it would have on the mechanism.
Isn't it true that Mr. Depp also testified that the bottle came from an off angle?
Yes.
Okay. And you consider that in rendering your opinions today, correct?
Yes, I believe he stated that it came from between 6 and 10 feet. I think it was I think he demonstrated it was off to his right. I can't recall specifically, but it was off angle, yes.
Okay. So it didn't come from the top, as you previously testified just a few minutes ago, correct?
Well, no, it would have struck the top of the finger, but it may have been slightly off angle in its approach based on the description.
Mr. Depp described it as off angle, correct?
Correct.
Dr. Moore, just at the outset, your billing rate for providing deposition testimony is $1,000 per hour?
That's correct.
All right. And you were deposed in this action for several hours on March 22nd, 2022?
That's correct.
And your billing rate for providing trial testimony is $5,000 per day?
That's correct.
You were retained in this case by Ms. Heard's legal team, correct?
Correct.
And over the last few years, you've provided expert services for one of Ms. Heard's law firms on at least 2 other cases, right?
That's correct, yes.
Dr. Moore, is it fair to say that you have no personal knowledge as to how Mr. Depp injured his finger in Australia, correct?
No, I have no personal knowledge. My impression is based on his description of the injury and available medical records for review.
But you weren't in Australia with Mr. Depp and Ms. Heard, correct?
I was not in Australia, no.
And so therefore you have no personal knowledge as to how that injury was sustained?
Correct.
All right. You also never personally examined Mr. Depp's finger, did you?
Correct.
You didn't examine Mr. Depp's finger at the time it was injured?
I did not.
And you never provided any medical treatment to Mr. Depp in connection with his finger injury, did you?
I did not.
Now, you've testified that you identified Mr. Depp's finger injury as a crush injury, correct?
Correct.
And a crush injury is when a body part is crushed or trapped between 2 opposing firm surfaces, yes?
Yes.
And a crush injury to a finger can occur when a foreign object hits the finger, right?
Yes.
And based on the pictures that you reviewed of Mr. Depp's finger injury, you cannot determine what particular object caused the injury to his finger, yes?
Well, I can't determine exactly what object did it. I think that I can say with confidence that the described mechanism of the bottle hitting and shattering the finger was not consistent with the appearance
I
of the injury.
understand that.
And
My
I think
question is just very specific. You can't determine the object that caused the injury to Mr. Depp's finger.
Well, it's a little bit more of a non-specific answer. I mean, again, I can't determine the exact object, but I can determine that it's unlikely that it was sustained in the manner described.
A bottle is a foreign object, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. So you can't rule out that the injury to Mr. Depp's finger was caused by a vodka bottle, correct?
Well, based on the injury pattern, I can say that the described mechanism of injury is inconsistent with medical findings.
Right. But because a vodka bottle is a foreign object, you can't rule out that a vodka bottle is what caused Mr. Depp's injury.
Well, I can't rule out that a vodka bottle caused the injury, but I can rule out that it was caused in the manner described in his testimony.
You can't rule out that the injury was caused by a knife, right?
I think it's unlikely that the injury was caused by a knife.
But you can't rule it out.
Well, if a simple knife laceration wouldn't impart the injury to the distal phalanx to result in the comminuted fracture. Now, a chopping type, but again, that would likely come from a direction that would create a dorsal injury to create the fracture that was developed.
Do you remember giving testimony in this case, Dr. Moore?
Deposition?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay. And you were under oath, correct?
correct.
All right. And that was on March 22nd, 2022, yes?
Correct.
Okay. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Dr. Moore, may I please have you go to page 163 of your deposition, specifically line 17. (163). Actually, apologies, 164. Line 4.
Correct.
Question, but you can't rule it out completely, right? Answer, I can't rule anything out completely. I can't rule out that he caught it in the door, cut it with a knife, or slammed it in the car door. Or, again, as Dr. Gilmer said, we can't definitively say what caused this injury. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Your Honor, I would object to the incomplete impeachment. I think if she's going to read his answer, she also needs to read or give Dr. Moore the chance to read the paragraph below. She just picked out half of his answer.
You can redirect.
Yeah,
I'll
as
overrule the
well as the
objection.
paragraph above.
Dr. Moore, there's no question pending. Thank you, though. So you can't rule out that the injury was caused by a car door either. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. But it's your testimony sitting here today that you can rule out that the injury was caused by a vodka bottle. Is that your testimony?
My testimony is that I can rule out the injury as caused by the mechanism described by Mr. Depp in his deposition.
But you can't definitively say what caused the injury to Mr. Depp's finger.
Well, the definitive injury is a crush injury, but again, I can't say. I mean, I think that it's quite likely that the initial mechanism described at the time of presentation of the accordion doors would classically create this injury pattern. You know, the hand up in front. If you picture accordion doors as the edge is closed, if the hand's up, the palm is exposed. If the door's pushed, and the
Dr.
hinge
Moore,
closes about the fingers.
I understand that. But
But
my question is,
I think it's important that they understand that.
this is the time for me to ask you questions. Your counsel will have the ability to rehabilitate you and ask you questions on redirect. Right now, let's try my question.
Okay.
You can't definitively say what caused the injury to Mr. Depp's fingers. Yes or no?
No.
Okay. In conducting your analysis of Mr. Depp's finger injury, you did not attempt to reconstruct the incident. Is that right?
Well, I think the incident was reconstructed. You mean did I throw a vodka bottle at something?
No, no, Dr. Moore. I mean, you didn't do any type of accident reconstruction, either computerized or you didn't conduct
No.
any type of accident reconstruction of the
No,
alleged.
that's correct. My opinion is based on the medical records and the clinical images and Mr. Depp's description.
And your analysis is based on an understanding of how Mr. Depp described the exact position of his finger at the time of the injury, yes?
Yes,
Okay. And your analysis is also based on the assumption that Mr. Depp's hand remained completely still in the instance that a vodka bottle was hurled at him, yes?
no, my assessment is on his description of the vodka bottle striking the top of his finger.
But his hand stayed still, according to your analysis, yes?
I guess it was still long enough for the bottle to hit it, but natural reaction would be to try to pull away.
When you perform traumatic finger surgeries, you inquire about the cause of the injuries, correct?
Correct.
And your best information on that is typically just the self-report of the patient, yes?
Correct.
And your assumption is that the patient is trying to get care. Because the patient is trying to get care, that person, that patient, is generally telling the truth, right?
You would hope so.
Yeah. You reviewed Dr. Kipper's deposition testimony informing your opinion about Mr. Depp's finger injury, correct?
Correct.
Informing your opinion, did you consider Dr. Kipper's deposition testimony that while Dr. Kipper was providing emergency treatment
Objection,
for
Your
Mr.
Honor.
Depp,
May we approach?
Okay.
let's start over because it's important the jury hears this. So informing your opinion, did you consider Dr. Kipper's deposition testimony that while Dr. Kipper was providing emergency treatment for Mr. Depp's finger injury in Australia in the driveway of the house, Mr. Depp told him that his finger was injured when Miss Heard threw a vodka bottle at him?
I don't recall that from the deposition. I'd be happy to review it if you have the deposition available.
Did you consider Dr. Kipper's testimony that he recalled that Mr. Depp's finger was found in the kitchen?
I do recall that.
So you must have also seen Dr. Kipper's deposition testimony that he wasn't the one who actually found the finger, correct?
That's correct.
Dr. Kipper testified that someone he thought was the chef told him he found the finger in the kitchen area, correct?
I'm going to assume so without reading the deposition now.
Did you review any testimony from Ben King in rendering your opinions today?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Did you see any of Mr. King's testimony at this trial?
I did not.
So you're not aware that Mr. King testified that he is the one who found Mr. Depp's finger, are you?
No.
And you're not aware that Mr. King testified that he found Mr. Depp's finger in the bar area, right?
Correct.
And you're not aware that Mr. King testified he found Mr. Depp's finger in a piece of tissue in the bar area, either?
No.
And you're not aware that Mr. King testified that multiple broken liquor bottles were also found in the bar area, right?
Correct.
If we could please pull up Defendant's Exhibit 1817, which is already in evidence. And it may be published, please.
I just don't have it yet.
That would help.
Yes. I just have a blank screen at the moment. There we go. Oh, sorry, something.
Thank
There we
you.
go. Okay.
Have you ever seen this picture before, Dr. Moore?
No.
So you're not aware that this is the bar area where Mr. King testified he found Mr. Depp's finger?
No.
Do you see that broken vodka bottle in the back corner near the bottom of the bar?
Yes.
Okay. Do you see the blood drops on the floor?
Yes.
Can we please pull up Defendant's Exhibit 1820, which is already in evidence? Have you seen this picture before, Dr. Moore?
I have not.
So you're not aware that this is also a picture from the bar area where Mr. King testified he found Mr. Depp's finger?
Correct.
Do you see the bloody tissue on the ground at the bottom of the bar?
Yes.
Do you see the blood drops around that tissue?
Yes.
So you didn't consider any of this evidence in rendering your opinion about how Mr. Depp injured his finger in Australia, did you?
I did not.
Okay. Nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you.
Redirect. Yes, sir.
Can you pull up Exhibit 1817 that was just shown to the witness, please? And can you blow up that what Ms. Vasquez referred to as a broken vodka bottle, Michelle, please? Dr. Moore, what, based on your review of the documents in this case, what did you understand to be the size of the bottle of vodka that Mr. Depp alleged cut off his finger?
The description was that it was a handle, a half-gallon bottle.
And that's bigger than a 750 mil or fifth of liquor, correct?
Yes.
And what size bottle, if to the extent that's even a bottle, what size does that appear to be to you?
Calls for speculation, Your Honor.
I'll sustain the objection.
Does that appear to be a handle?
It is.
Objection calls for speculation.
I'll sustain the objection.
You can take that down. Dr. Moore, Ms. Vasquez just asked you about Dr. Kipper's deposition testimony, and she said, is that where she claims that Mr. Depp allegedly told him that the finger was severed from a vodka bottle. Do you remember that question a few minutes ago?
Objection leading.
Overruled.
I do remember that question.
Yes, thank you. Is that consistent, that alleged account, is that consistent with the texts you reviewed between Mr. Depp and Dr. Kipper?
No.
And what did those texts say?
As I recall, Mr. Depp indicated that he had cut his finger off.
Now, Ms. Vasquez wouldn't let you finish when you were trying to explain to the jury how Mr. Depp's account of injuring his finger in an accordion door would be perfectly consistent with the photographs you saw. Could you please explain that to the jury?
Well, so again, we tend to try to believe patients. We hope that they come in with an honest history initially, and that's a reasonable mechanism for this to have occurred. And again, if you picture your hand up with either a closure of a hinge or a closure of a door, the palmar surface is exposed. If it's caught in that hinge as it closes, it could be slightly off center. It would pinch that tissue away in a similar fashion, but because it's below the level of the nail bed, it could create this injury with the fracture, the tissue loss, and preserve the nail bed.
Can you look at page 164 of your deposition, the one that Ms. Vasquez just showed you?
Yes.
Objection, Your Honor. I'm going to object on hearsay grounds.
Your Honor, she only...
Oh, overruled.
Thank you. Ms. Vasquez asked you a question, and then she read your answer, trying to impeach you, but she only read half of the answer. So I'm going to read the whole answer to the jury, and I'm going to ask you to tell me if I'm reading your answer right, okay? The question is on page 164, line 4, but you can't rule it out completely, right? And you answered, I can't rule anything out completely. I can't rule out that he caught it in the door, cut it with a knife, or slammed it in the car door, or again, as Dr. Gilmore said, we can't definitively say what caused this injury. And then you go on to say, this is where Ms. Vasquez cut you off and didn't let you finish.
I don't think that's in the transcript. Objection.
I'll sustain that.
The rest of your answer that she didn't read to you, Dr. Moore, is the question I can answer is that the mechanism that was described by Mr. Depp and demonstrated by Mr. Depp is inconsistent with the injury pattern that's found on the images and the description. Did I read that right?
Yes.
And does that remain your opinion today?
Yes.
Has anything that's been presented to you on cross-examination changed any of the opinions that you hold in this case?
No.
I have nothing further. Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Moore, you're free to go, or you can stay in the courtroom. It's up to you. All right, thank you. All right, your next witness,
Your Honor, we'd like to call Dr. David Spiegel.
Dr. Spiegel. All right, that's fine. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right. The doctor can be sworn.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm to testify truthfully in this case in penalty of law?
Thank you, Your Honor. Will you please tell the jury your full name and business address?
David R. Spiegel. I'm a physician. I work at 825 Fairfax Avenue in Norfolk, Virginia, as part of the Eastern Virginia Medical School.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a physician psychiatrist.
And where do you work? Do you work at?
I work at Eastern Virginia. I'm employed by Eastern Virginia Medical School, but I also work at Norfolk General Hospital, which is the teaching hospital in Norfolk.
How many years have you been practicing as a psychiatrist?
I entered residency in 1989. I graduated residency in 1993. So from 1993 to today, I've been in physician practicing.
So that's almost 30
That's
years?
30 years, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Please describe for the jury the nature of your clinical practice.
So my clinical practice is comprised of both inpatient care at Norfolk General Hospital, as well as my outpatient practice at Eastern Virginia Medical School. About 85 to 90% of my day is clinical between the two components.
And what is involved in a comprehensive evaluation?
So in a comprehensive evaluation, in addition to reviewing the historical information that you receive from collateral other sources, you undertake a history from the patient. You get, whether it's the history of current illness, the past psychiatric history, family history, social history, legal, substance history. Then you do what's called a mental status exam, which is the psychiatric version of the physical exam, where you're actually giving a description of what you see in front of you. Then you can do cognitive testing, which tests the patient memory, attention, concentration, etc. Then you come up with a working and a differential diagnosis, describe any other additional testing you may need or not need, and then you come up with a treatment plan.
How many patients have you treated over the 30 years?
Quite a lot, probably in the tens of thousands.
And how many patients do you regularly see?
So inpatient is generally about 5 to 8, sometimes more. Outpatients, probably 5 to 6, sometimes more. I should point out that my inpatient work is divided between consultation, psychiatry, and I believe we're going to talk about that, as well as working on the inpatient service. So I believe we will talk about that.
What, if any, differences are there on how many patients you see on weekends as opposed to weekdays?
So when I'm on call, which is on either a Saturday or a Sunday meeting, I have to be in the hospital and around. That's probably an additional 35 plus patients.
How frequently do you treat patients who abuse drugs and alcohol?
Unfortunately, drugs and alcohol are part of psychiatric practice. And so probably 3/4 of my patients have substance abuse problems.
Does this include both legal and illegal drugs?
Yes. Put them both together, probably 75%.
And how frequently do you treat patients who have suffered from someone in their lives who abuses alcohol and drugs?
On a regular basis, like I said, on a daily basis. This is part of what psychiatry is.
And as part of that treatment of patients who abuse drugs and alcohol, do you evaluate the impact of the abuse on their brains and personal interactions with others?
Yes, substance of abuse, both in the short term and the long term, can affect the brain in terms of mood, behavior, cognition, meaning attention, concentration, memory, ability to control your behavior, as well as your overall level of functioning. It can affect it in the short term, such as alcoholic blackouts. It can affect it by causing stroke, such as stimulants can. And so at the end of the day, it's a rather lengthy list of what substance abuse can do to the human brain.
Dr. Spiegel, how frequently have you treated patients who have suffered intimate partner violence?
Again, it's very unfortunate that probably 50% of my patients suffer from trauma. If I had to guess of those 50%, probably 25% of my practice is people who have suffered intimate partner violence.
And how consistent is that with the national average?
In America, unfortunately, it's about 20 to 25%, depending on the study, of women have complained, have reported intimate partner violence.
And how frequently have you treated patients who have perpetrated the intimate partner violence?
So again, in the outpatient setting, I don't see it quite as much, but in the inpatient setting, again, it's a really relative common phenomenon that I will see perpetrators of partner violence, and they're patients who need treatment too.
And overall, how many patients have you treated who have been perpetrators of intimate partner violence?
Perpetrators?
Yes.
Probably 5 to 10% of the patients I do is perpetrators.
And would you say tens of thousands over the 30 years?
Yes.
And leading.
Overruled.
Thank you. As part of treating patients relating to intimate partner violence, do you regularly evaluate these patients?
Do I regularly evaluate the patient?
Evaluate the patient, yes.
Oh, yes. Yes, regularly. I mean, they get the same comprehensive evaluation that I described before.
Are you licensed in Virginia?
Yes, I am.
And when did you first become licensed in Virginia?
1993.
Have you been qualified by courts as an expert witness?
Yes, I have.
In how many states have you been qualified as an expert?
3, which would be Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina.
Dr. Spiegel, can you please review for the jury your educational background beginning with your undergraduate studies?
So I went to Duke University undergrad. I went to medical school at the State University of New York Health Science Center in Brooklyn, formerly known as Downstate Medical Center. I did my internship and residency between Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center and Penn State Hershey Medical Center.
And
I'm also fellowship board certified in consultation liaison psychiatry.
okay. And where did you do your residency and your internships?
So I did my residency for Penn State and internship at Dartmouth.
Okay. And what is your current title and position?
So I am the acting chair, endowed chair, and professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Eastern Virginia Medical School.
Are you board certified?
Yes, I am.
And what are you board certified in?
General adult psychiatry and consultation liaison psychiatry is a subspecialty.
Okay. So you have 2 board certifications.
Yes.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what's involved in board certifications in those 2 fields?
So board certification is the standard we strive to in being a physician or any other mental health practitioner. It involves taking a very comprehensive test at the beginning of your career to initiate board certification. Then you get tested again every 10 years. Then you have to go through continual medical education throughout the entire period. You have to do what's called performance in practice, which is basically ways to improve things in your practice. And again, this occurs always throughout the years.
Okay. Now, are you a member of any professional organizations?
Yes, I am.
Could you
I'm
please
a
tell the
member
jury?
of the American Psychiatric Association, as well as the fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. I'm a member of the Medical Society of Virginia. I'm a member of the Psychiatric Society of Virginia. I'm a member of the Tidewater Academy of Psychiatry, and I'm a member of the Academy of Consultation Liaison Psychiatry.
Do you have any teaching responsibilities?
Teaching, oh yeah.
Teaching, yes.
So yes, so teaching is a daily occurrence as part of my job when I do my inpatient rounds. Residents, medical students, physician assistant students are assigned. So we round together, and there's teaching with every single encounter. In addition to that, I teach lectures to the residents, to the third, second, and first year medical students, as well as a fourth year medical student lecture as well. So I'm constantly teaching.
Have you engaged in any hands-on training of psychiatrists practicing in Virginia
Hands-on training with the residents?
with psychiatrists?
Oh, yeah. So again, I'm teaching at bedside. I mean, we don't speak in front of the patient, obviously, but I'm teaching at bedside, meaning after we see a patient, we discuss the important points to learn. And again, that includes residents at every level. That includes medical students, third, second, and first year physician assistant students. So every day is a teaching explanation session to the students and residents.
What is your role at Eastern Virginia Medical School as the acting chair? Please tell the jury what that means.
So as the acting chair, you are not only accountable for your own practice, but you are accountable for your faculty members' practices. So I have to make sure that everyone is treating, seeing, evaluating a certain number of patients. I have responsible for their academic requirements, so in terms of publishing, et cetera. I'm responsible for their teaching assignments to other residents, to other students. I'm responsible for fiscally that they are accountable to their fiscal productivity. So, and a heck of a lot of other administrative meetings that I go to.
Have you published in your field?
To the tune of about 80 manuscripts, and I have my own book on catatonia and the consultation liaison setting. I have a book chapter on the current and current and contemporary approaches to temporomandibular disease, at least the psychiatric portion. I'm also in a dissociative identity disorders chapter on a wiki book.
And have you peer-reviewed literature?
Yes, so I'm a reviewer I've served as a reviewer on Lancet. I've served as a reviewer as Innovations in Clinical Neuroscience. I've served on reviewer for Clinical Neuropharmacology, and I'm actually editor-in-chief at this point, of Clinical Neuropharmacology.
Have you lectured on the effects of drugs and alcohol on the human brain?
Yes, I teach to the residents. I teach lecture to the second year medical students, third year medical students. So I am fully aware of not only what I teach, but what I see in the emergency room and the consultation and inpatient settings.
Have you published and lectured on the causes and effects of intimate partner abuse?
Yes, I punctured, I believe, 2 articles on the effects of trauma, and in that trauma was intimate partner violence.
Are you familiar with the hallmarks of intimate partner violence?
Yes.
Are you familiar with what causes intimate partner violence?
One more, excuse me?
What causes intimate partner violence?
Yes, there's a multiple explanation that cause intimate partner violence. And if I can just mention at this point too, that when we are discussing intimate partner violence, I think it's imperative for the jury to know we are talking about repetitive behavior over periods of time. And the type of abuse can be any physical, psychological, sexual, but just as important is for one of the partners to maintain some uneven element of control or to maintain power, control, or authority. So there are a lot of facets to intimate partner violence. I know people tend to think of it as just the actual abuse act, but there's more to it than just the actual abuse act. Abuse act's important, but it's not the sole thing.
Your Honor, I move to qualify Dr. Spiegel as an expert in the field of psychiatry and behavioral sciences with specific emphasis on drug and alcohol abuse, intimate partner violence, and the effect of these as they pertain to the issues in this case.
All right, any objection?
Your Honor,
You wish to voir dire?
I do.
Okay. To his qualifications.
His qualification.
Okay, thank you.
Sir, you talked about 2 board certifications, general adult psychiatry
Yes.
and liaison consultation psychiatry.
Other way around, but consultation liaison.
psychiatry.
Subtle point.
Right. Now, that is not intimate partner violence. That deals with a issue of comorbidity between people who have medical problems and health problems.
So you're saying it's subspecialty?
Yes.
So consultation liaison psychiatry does have that, but you're also treating patients who have medical illness, who have comorbid psychiatric illness, or people who have psychiatric illness that have comorbid medical illness. And many of the patients that I see on the trauma service have tried to take their own life. And unfortunately, as part of that, intimate partner violence and trauma in general is part and parcel of that. So it's very, very narrow to say it's just a medical psychiatric interface. It's much more of psychiatric patients who need medical help, medical patients who develop psychiatric problems, but also that interface.
So as a subset of your trauma patients, which you say are about 50% of your practice, as a subset of that practice, some people have been involved with intimate partner violence.
So as a subset of my overall practice, 50% have suffered from trauma. About half of that number have suffered from, I'm sorry, about 20, so it's 20, about 20% that suffer from IP, intimate partner violence.
All right. You've never conducted any empirical research on individuals who experienced intimate partner violence, have you, sir?
If your definition is trials, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Like pharmaceutical trials, or what are you saying? Is that what you're saying? Because I've done review articles on patients who suffered from trauma. So the answer is, I haven't done any studies like where you give them medication for treatment or try one treatment versus another. I've reviewed the body of literature on intimate partner
And you're not associated with any professional literature on IPV.
I'm sorry, repeat the question, sir?
Is there any professional literature that you've contributed to relative to IPV specifically as opposed to trauma generally?
The answer to the question again, sir, is that you cannot separate this artificial separation you are trying to do between trauma and intimate partner violence. It is part and parcel of trauma. We don't thread it like that.
Your Honor, plaintiff would accept this witness as an expert on general psychiatry, and with respect to the drug usage issues that Ms. Bredehoff referenced, but not with respect to IPV.
All right, over objection, he's entered as an expert as stated on the record. All right, you may continue. Thank you.
Very much, Your Honor. Dr. Spiegel, at our request, what have you reviewed in this case? And just go ahead and give me more
So
general.
it's a lengthy review, but court filings, psychological testing that was done on Ms. Hurd by both Dr. Hughes and Dr. Curry, other physicians' medical records, other physician note, Dr. Kipper, counselors and therapists that both parties and psychiatrists that they went to, text messages,
you remember my question? Did you review the
I reviewed
deposition and testimony of Dr. Curry?
Dr.
Curry.
Yes, I reviewed Dr. Yes, I'm sorry.
And-
Yes, so I reviewed testimony of Dr. Curry. I reviewed Dr. Curry's reports. I reviewed Dr. Curry's testimony.
Okay, and what if, did you review the deposition and trial testimony of Dr. Hughes?
Yes.
Objection, Your Honor, beyond the scope of the disclosure.
I'll allow that.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Did you interview Mr. Depp?
No, I did not.
Did you
But-
request to
I
interview?
requested to interview Mr. Depp twice, and both times Mr. Depp and his lawyers refused.
Dr. Spiegel, I'm going to ask you some questions in this case respecting your opinions and the opinions you have formed and the bases for them. And I'm going to ask you to provide me with, in a reasonable degree of medical probability or certainty. Can you do that?
Yes.
Okay. On what were you requested to analyze and opine in this case?
So it's fourfold. One, I was asked to opine about the risk factors that are associated with intimate partner violence and behaviors that are shown, risk factors that are shown in intimate partner violence to be consistent with behaviors that Mr. Depp has demonstrated. Two, I've been asked to opine about the acute effects on alcohol and substance use, and I mentioned that including mood, behavior, cognition, functional impairment. Three, talking about the psychological profile, if you would, of, is there a question? I'm sorry. Oh.
No.
Okay. Of psychological and medical sequelae of patients who have suffered intimate partner violence and perpetrated intimate partner violence, and whether or not Mr. Depp's behavior is consistent with that. And lastly, about alcohol and other substance use disorders, their diagnostic criteria, their medical and psychological effects, psychiatric effects, their cognitive effects, and their functional effects. And I think I would like to just go with the jury one other thing. When we talk about, when psychiatry talks about substance use disorders, it's imperative to understand we're not talking about someone who rarely uses and happens to have a bad night. We're not talking about someone who uses on a weekly basis and has a bad night. We're talking about repetitive patterns of behavior that meet a list of 11 criteria that can be deemed mild, moderate, or severe. Because I think people get confused when they hear the word substance abuse, that they think of, oh, I may have used this because I used it twice. There is a whole criteria of behavior and sequelae and consequences that go with a substance use disorder. I'm not just talking about someone who will occasionally smoke a joint or smokes a joint or snorts occasionally coke, okay, or has alcohol on weekends. So I really need to reiterate that, because I think when you look at psychiatric behavior, we tend to look, people look online and say, my gosh, I have all 7 of these, right? And they're reading it not quite the way the psychiatric literature is supposed to go. So please, when I'm talking about this, I need you to understand, one, that that's what's going on. As I told you about intimate partner violence, it's horrible that anyone would strike anyone, okay? But again, we're talking about repetitive behaviors for means of control, right? So that's real important to understand when you're moving forward. And I may say occasionally substance abuse, but what I'm referring to is substance
Objection
use.
beyond the scope of the question.
I don't,
Sustained. Next question.
okay. Dr. Spiegel, could you please just summarize for the jury the conclusions you came to with your opinions, and then we'll take you through the specifics.
So in my opinion, based on my a review of the evidence, based on my clinical experience, based on my publishing experience, based on my teaching experience, that Mr. Depp has behaviors that are consistent with both someone who has a substance use disorder as well as consistent behaviors for someone who is a perpetrator of intimate partner violence.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the impact of drug and alcohol abuse over time. First of all, based upon your review of the record evidence, what type of drugs has Mr. Depp used?
So Mr. Depp, and I'm talking about use, we're talking about a substance use disorder here. We're not just talking about use, okay? So we are talking about alcohol, We are talking about amphetamines. We are talking about marijuana. We are talking about cocaine. We are talking about LSD. We are talking about ecstasy. We are talking about opiates. We are talking about prescription benzodiazepines. And we'll get into a separate thing about the abusability of Seroquel and or gabapentin or Neurontin. And we are talking about, much of the time, concurrent use, meaning simultaneously.
In your practice, do some patients suggest to you that drugs and alcohol actually help them?
So I think it's patients who lack insight or are in the very early stages of recognizing they have a quote-unquote problem will sometimes actually say that they have this medication actually calms me down, this medication makes me feel better. And in actuality, they may not acutely feel anything, but chronic and continual use will take its toll on the brain. So the answer is yes, but again, people who have substance use disorders have lack of insight and a lack of judgment about what's going on, the very poor moderators of their own behavior.
Has Mr. Depp suggested, based on your review of the record evidence, that alcohol and drugs actually help him?
In review of the evidence, he has suggested that alcohol, Xanax, I'm in the list of medications, do help. Although I will also tell you on review of the evidence that there were at least 2 times I can remember that Mr. Depp was referring to at least short-lived periods of sobriety, and I cannot exactly tell you what that included. That both times he said that he functioned better and that he recognized that alcohol and drugs was at the root of his problems.
Now, there's been testimony that Mr. Depp is quite charming, both off and on the drugs and the alcohol. What is your answer to that?
So, again, let me put one thing clear here. I am not here to impeach Mr. Depp's acting skills or his persona. He has way greater skills than I do in that. What I'm here to say is talk about how drugs and alcohol affect what we all have in common. We're all human beings. We can all only get so much, take so much when something is going to happen. And that's what I see every day in the emergency room, on the consult service, on inpatient psychiatry. Bad things happen, not because of anything special, except we're all human beings and our brains, substance abuse, are not titrated. They are not regulated by the FDA. We don't know what we're getting. We don't know how much we're getting. There is no control over what makes it to our brain. So it is not the actor. It is not the persona, okay? It is a person just like the rest of us who are human beings who will have these effects, and that's what we all share in common. Everyone in this courtroom shares that in common.
When Mr. Depp was in his relationship with Amber Heard, was he a polysubstance abuser?
Was he in what substance abuse?
Polysubstance
Yes.
abuser? Can you explain to the jury what that is?
Overruled.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so polysubstance abuse is the use of 3 or more substances. And I answer, like I said, concurrently, he was. Even while I was getting ready for rehab on the island, he was. So, yes, he did engage in that.
Did Mr. Depp's drug and alcohol abuse affect him cognitively?
Yes. So, if nothing else to look at, Dr. Blaustein, a psychiatrist that evaluated Mr. Depp, did a mini mental state exam on him. And as part of that mini mental state examination, you're asked to remember 3 words and then come back 5 minutes later and repeat those 3 words. And in the meanwhile, you're getting other types of testing for attention and concentration and visual, spatial, and language. So other things that are being tested too. Mr. Depp was unable to recall any of them, and that is very unusual for a 50-ish year old male. I don't remember how old he was when he took that. Generally speaking, that age group should be remembering 2 or all 3 of those words. One, I do know that his lines were also fed to him by earpiece. Again, affecting memory. I did see in video deposition about having to have questions, I don't want to say repeat as much as completely forgotten. So the answer is yes. And you know, any one of us who use alcohol and cocaine to that level of degree, and I'm talking about a severe level of substance use disorder, are going to have effects. It is inescapable because we all have brains that are malaffected by extensive substance use, and potentially sometimes less, but certainly what we're talking about here is extensive.
What, if anything did you observe from the record evidence about Mr. Depp having difficulty focusing, his attention span, processing, whether he could function as an actor?
So,
Objection compound.
Compound is only if it's
Overruled.
Thank you.
So again, in terms of the acting part, we do know that he needed his lines fed to him for movies. Part of that could have been also due to, and I don't know which movie, and please forgive me about that he actually confessed he did a movie entirely wasted. So I imagine it would be harder to do that. Additionally, like I said, when I looked at deposition, you can tell that the processing speed was down. His thinking rate was down. If your thinking rate is down, and I'm not talking about, again, I'm getting older, Mike. I'm probably not as sharp as I was at 25, okay? But I'm talking about so slow that when we're trying to move on to other questions, we're still trying to answer the original data that's presented to us. So attention span is very much impaired. And if your attention span is impaired, your memory is going to be impaired. It is inescapable that that's going to happen. So all that comes into play there. And that's what I witnessed in the video deposition. Fortunately for Mr. Depp, I do see that during this trial, his cognition has improved somewhat, which will happen if you are sober. So I commend him on that. But again, I'm specifically referencing the time with Ms. Heard's and Mr. Depp's relationship. So we're talking about that.
What, if any, observations from the record evidence did you have about Mr. Depp having alcoholic blackouts or foggy mind?
Again, there were reported times where he would be essentially, quote unquote, passed out drunk. You saw pictures of him passed out drunk and not being able to remember what he did, which is, again, if you look at the record evidence, you will see that, and this is linking intimate partner violence and substance uses together. I know we're going to get to that, which is basically if you have blackouts and you're using alcohol or using cocaine, it's going to be near impossible to remember what happened the night before. I don't think I'm the first person that's ever told you that alcohol can cause blackouts. And basically, alcohol decreases a brain chemical, glutamate, which is involved in memory formation. If it blocks that to an extensive degree, the individual cannot remember what happened because they didn't have enough time for their brain to process the memory. You need this brain chemical. So does alcoholic blackouts happen every time? No, of course not. But are they a complication of a use disorder? Absolutely yes. And there was record evidence of that.
Dr. Spiegel, you said at one point alcohol and cocaine. Is it possible to have blackouts with alcohol and different types of substances?
Yes. So my clinical experience, and I'll date it back within the last month, we had a patient who was using both, especially cocaine, and she had these kind of stroke-like lesions around the brain center known as the hippocampus, which is involved in memory formation. So
Objection relevance.
Just giving an example.
Overruled.
Combining the two substances together increases the likelihood, even if you don't get what is a major stroke. And again, we think of a major stroke as someone who has speech difficulties and movement difficulties. There's a lot of different types of stroke that can just affect cognition. They don't necessarily have to have severe movement deficits or severe language deficits. They can solely affect you in terms of your cognitive symptoms. and actually known as a vascular neurocognitive disorder. So you need to understand, and that's part of the psychiatric diagnosis. You need to understand that you can have these insults, these lesions, these strokes, without demonstrating physical features. And at a minimal, we know that he was using both substances concurrently, and at middle, we know he had cognitive issues that we talked about, or at least had some of them.
Thank you, Dr. Spiegel. What, if any, correlation is there between domestic abuse, heavy alcohol abuse, and cognitive disorders?
So, the risk factors, if you would, for intimate partner violence, okay, and there are probably many of them. I don't have time to go over all of them, but the ones in particular, characters in particular, are one, having someone in the relationship who is jealous or suspicious. Two, having someone who has a higher than average acceptance of violence ideations. Three, someone who has rapid and extreme mood shifts. Four, someone who has limited self-control. One of the roles of cognition, one of the roles of our brain, is to prevent inappropriate behaviors and acting out on thoughts. We all get angry at people. That's human. We all get angry at people. We all think things about people. The difference is when our brains are intact and working well, most of us don't act them out, okay? Most of us do not act them out. So that's because your frontal lobe and other parts of the brain are involved in making sure these negative thoughts don't get acted on, okay? So when you have the effects of alcohol acutely, it causes disinhibition, which means you are, by definition, losing control and having rapid mood swings. Two, you are affecting parts of the brain that are involved in what we call social processing cues. So you no longer can interpret what's in front of you that is, I would say, right or wrong, or what I should act on and what I shouldn't act on. So we act on them, even though sober, and I've seen it with Mr. Depp's record evidence. I've seen it clinically. Sober, we can contain that. We can contain that. But when you have these mixtures together, knowing, by the way, that about 40 up to 60% of intimate partner violence is done under the influence of alcohol and or substance use disorders, okay? Knowing that treating it gets it better, improves, I'm not saying removes it, but improves it. Hearing from Mr. Depp's own text to Dr. Kipper that he was better with that things are going better, will show you that given those confluence of factors, given them all lining up, the risk factors, combined with something that when any of us use to a certain amount, if we're novice at it, it'll be a lot less. If we're more experienced and have more tolerance and dependence, it's going to take a lot more, but inevitably will make us disinhibited and will make us act out, and acting out could be done in a lot of different ways in intimate partner violence, okay? With also remembering, control is the end game of intimate partner violence. So that's how they basically interact in a nutshell.
Ms. Bretterhoff, I assume you have,
I have quite a bit more.
let's go ahead and take our morning recess. Ladies and gentlemen, just do not discuss the case and don't do any outside research. We'll be back with you
Oh, I'm sorry.
in 15 minutes. We're just,
Sorry, I
we're
talked
just
too
taking a
much.
break. No, we're just taking a break. All right, let's just take a break till 11 then, and we'll come back at 11, okay?
Thank you, Your Honor.
ready for the jury?
Yes,
Your Honor, can we approach before the jury? can-
Okay, sure. Thank you. You may be seated. All right, your next question. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Spiegel, before we took the break, you were talking about the correlation between domestic abuse, heavy alcohol abuse, and cognitive disorders. Does the literature support your testimony on this?
Yes, the literature fully supports everything I just said through that interaction.
Thank you. Now, you indicated that you reviewed Mr. Depp's video depositions. Is that correct? The
Yes.
ones from November 10 through 12 of 2020 and December 14 of 2021. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Did you reach any conclusions about his cognitive symptoms, insight, and judgment in watching those?
So during the video deposition, what was readily apparent was a gentleman who had a significant delay in processing speed. And like I said, when you have a delay in processing speed, many other cognitive functions are going to follow. You're going to be impaired attention, concentration, memory. All that's going to happen. In terms of having to, the speech process, if you heard the deposition, the way the thoughts were conveyed were much more in the way of kind of disconnected, disjointed statements. It wasn't that they were not necessarily understandable, but they didn't have any coherent pattern until he was more structured by Ms. Bredehoff to kind of get to the point of the question, which happened throughout most of the deposition. And so you could see there that there was obviously some form of cognitive issue that should not be happening in someone in their mid-50s, and probably due to the alcohol and substances.
What, if any, observations did you make about impulse control?
So during the deposition? Or,
Yes, or,
okay.
and,
Or any
and
other
on the
time?
record evidence either.
So, again, I think that under the guise of not being acutely intoxicated, I think Mr. Depp was able to control much of his behavior, much of his thinking, even if it was aberrant or negative, he was able to control that. I think that once you start getting to the point of adding substances to that, that will set it over. If you saw the video, I think you all did, about the in the kitchen where there was smashing of glasses, slamming of cupboards, and yelling at Ms. Heard that you don't exist. And throughout the deposition of Dr. Kipper, Mr. Depp is firing him and rehiring him and yelling and screaming. And I do believe that a lot of it had to do with the interaction of, hey, we're trying to help you get sober, okay? And it is obviously something you are resisting, not ready for, not wanting. And so you saw a lot of yelling, a lot of acting out, if you would, which puts you on the state of, hey, this is a gentleman who has really significant trouble with delaying gratification, okay, delaying reward. And certainly one way to make that significantly worse is with substances. There's no question about that.
And you may have subsumed this in, but what, if anything, did you observe relating to erratic behavior based on the record evidence?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, when you talk about erratic behavior, Dr. Kipper's deposition, I believe it was, where, and I think I made a particular note of this only because I'm a psychiatrist myself. There was a very large ranting about Dr. Cowan, who was Ms. Heard's psychologist therapist. And the language, you can be dissatisfied with your provider. I have no problem with that. You could be dissatisfied and you have the right to go to wherever you want to go to. But the texting that were involved in this in terms of erratic behavior was disturbing in terms of the verbiage used, the phrases used. Am I free to use some of the language, or should I reserve that, Your Honor?
Go ahead.
I can?
Believe me, the jury's been hearing it.
Okay, all right, I want to make sure. Jury, I want to make sure, okay. So it's something along the line that Dr. Kipper is an effing charlatan. He ought to...
Objection, hearsay.
It was,
He's entitled to rely on it and he's to give his examples.
He can talk about what he developed from the hearsay, but not repeat it himself.
He's entitled to give examples of it.
I'll
from the
sustain the
hearsay.
objection.
Without giving the exact words that you recall.
oh, without giving the
Go ahead,
exact
just-
words?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, without giving the exact words, it was basically vulgar language directed towards Dr. Cowan throughout multiple texts, multiple things that Dr. Cowan were doing in therapy. It was, like I say, it was without relaying it, the exact thing. I'm trying to be as accurate as I can. And I think at the end of it, I think he was also talking about that Dr. Cowan was filling Amber with positive thoughts, or therapeutic.
Objection, hearsay.
I think he's keeping it more general and he's entitled to rely on. Thank you.
So more along the line of giving Amber psychiatric jargon to put on him. And actually, what I read and interpreted what Dr. Cowan's was getting blasted for was he was, kind of teaching Amber how to use conflict resolution in a more appropriate manner and learning to express things more rationally rather than express things as irrational as they have been expressed. And for that, there were a lot of negativity being sworn at. So again, erratic behavior in terms of writing a text, but I have no problem with people being angry, okay, none whatsoever. It's just the expressing of it and the continual ranting of it was very uncomfortable for me to read. But regardless, I think we have seen in terms of erratic behavior, much of the psychological and the physical maltreatment we talked about.
Objection beyond the scope of the question.
I don't agree.
I'll sustain. Next question.
Okay. Mr. Depp is 58 years old. Are the behaviors that you have been describing for the jury, are those typical and age-related?
No, so, well, I don't consider 58 years old, I'm 59, okay? I will tell you that the age-related changes that occur in humans are very erratic, hit and miss, meaning they'll occasionally be there. You may need a little bit more time to answer a question or pull things out of memory. You're just a little bit slow and a lot more inconsistently slow. You wouldn't describe what Dr. Blaustein's changes were or what I saw in the deposition attributed to age.
Dr. Spiegel, what is Seroquel?
Seroquel or quetiapine is actually an atypical antipsychotic, which is indicated for many things, including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, adjunctive treatment for major depression. So it's indicated for a lot of things.
But what effects may it have? I mean, this is one of the drugs that Mr. Depp was taking,
Yes.
correct? It was a prescribed drug?
Yes.
Okay.
So-
yeah, please
So
explain.
the effect of Seroquel is it's very often used as a sleeping agent because it doesn't have a lot of the side effects that are associated with conventional antipsychotics, movement disorders, thyroid dyskinesia, et cetera, or at least it's a very low risk of that. So people have used it off-label, physicians have used it off-label to help them sleep. The problem is the effect is very barbiturate-like, and it really knocks people out, or certainly if you use it at high enough doses it can, okay? And the problem is it also has street value. So it's absolutely used on the street for that downer-like effect, and obviously it's a little bit more readily available because it's prescribed. So it does have that street value portion of it.
And Dr. Spiegel, what effect would this have on Mr. Depp based on the dosages he was taking?
So I think what you're looking at is
Objection, speculation.
Overruled. Please continue.
what you will see in patients who have substance use disorders are people who unfortunately kind of wake up and fall asleep only through pharmacological assistance, meaning that their own circadian rhythms are no longer in control of that behavior. So you will take stimulants to quote unquote get you up in the morning, and then you will take things like quetiapine, Seroquel to knock you out. So basically what these are being used for is I'm going to get up and I'm going to get knocked out. And that's very characteristic of what would be actually legal prescribed substances. That's not illegal at all. That's very legal. And that's the seemingly what these medicines effect are on patients who have substance use disorder.
Dr. Spiegel, what is Neurontin?
So Neurontin is actually an anti-seizure medicine, which I think it's indicated for seizures, and it might be indicated for one chronic pain condition, although I can't swear that to you. That said, again, in a substance use disorder population, it has significant street value, and people who misuse opiates often supplement that with Neurontin because it has this anti-pain calming effect. So unfortunately, it also can cause respiratory suppression, and so when you use it with opiates, there are people that are lucky enough to succumb to respiratory suppression as a result, but it has a very additive, calming effect that people use it for.
And what effect would this have on Mr. Depp in the dosage he was taking?
Again, I was looking for an objection. Okay, again, what it would do is have the street value of using it with the opiates. The advantage is you're using it with opiates, and it's because opiates in general, despite everything else it does, are calming. And you use it with it, it offers further calming, which is why doctors have been warned not to prescribe medications like gabapentin and opiates together unless under significant, strict following, because it can cause serious problems, such as death, respiratory suppression.
And Mr. Depp was also taking Adderall, correct?
Yes.
Can you please describe to the jury what that impact would have, and particularly in connection with the dosages?
So Adderall is a psychostimulant, which is prescribed relatively regularly for ADHD. The problem comes again when you shouldn't be prescribing or receiving Adderall when you're already misusing cocaine. Okay, you're now doubling your stimulant dosage here. And basically, what you are talking about, again, it comes down to in the substance use disorder population, you are using it to stay awake, have energy, keep yourself going, getting high, getting energetic, and then the only way to kind of combat that, because you have this effect, is to kind of take downers during the day, and downers being anything that's calming. So anywhere from opiates, prescription, anywhere from Neurontin, anywhere from Seroquel, all medications that are which are abusable. And so that's what this is going on. That's what the substance use disorder patient has, and it can't be given with someone using cocaine, because that's an extreme risk for death. You can't be given together.
And what, if any, effect would these drugs have if they were mixed with MDMA or cocaine?
So when you combine the two together, like I talked about before, there are effects where you are looking at, right, the predisposing traits of intimate partner violence. So jealousy, rapid mood changes, poor self-control, and to some degree, condoning violence to a certain degree. When you combine them all together, you get this disinhibiting euphoriant effect from cocaine and Adderall. Then when you combine the two together, what happens, you get too much, and then you start getting irritable, you start getting agitated, okay? You start becoming suspicious, jealous, potentially disinhibited, psychotic, and these are the risks. And again, we're talking about not your average everyday use of these substances. We are talking about chronic use together. And we also know that alcohol and cocaine use independently increase significantly the risk of intimate partner violence. These aren't statistics I'm coming up with. They all depend, anywhere from reports up to 7 to 27-fold. So you are, quote unquote, colloquially playing with fire when you are talking about substances and intimate partner violence. You are playing with fire. And that's all of us.
And the substances that Mr. Depp was taking and the record evidence relating to those, did you draw any conclusions concerning whether he met this criteria or these risk factors?
So in terms of substance use disorder, when you look at it, so major role obligations not being fulfilled, don't have any evidence about operating under the influence or not. Social issues, especially disagreements and arguments with your spouse or family. Obviously, there was tolerance and dependence for the amount he was using, because if anyone is naive to these medications, most of us would be dead. Unsuccessful efforts, difficulty cutting back, using more than intended, giving up social, occupational obligations because this. I know there was right after the rehab on the island in Australia when Mr. Depp went out partying with Marilyn Manson. And
Objection beyond the scope of the question.
Actually, that's asking for the record evidence for
I'll
this.
sustain the objection. Next question.
Okay.
What other record evidence did you have supporting this?
Psychological, using despite the fact it causes known psychological, psychiatric, or medical effects. And I think that's been pretty well documented. So in this case, you're talking about someone who has a severe substance use disorder. I do want to emphasize, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that intimate partner violence and substance use disorders are two scourges in this country. They're two plagues. This is very serious stuff we're playing with. And when you are just getting someone closer and closer to the threshold.
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance.
This is highly relevant, Your Honor.
I'll overrule as to relevance.
Beyond the scope.
Go ahead.
Beyond the scope of the question.
Yes.
All right, I'll sustain that objection.
All right. Tell me more about the relationships between substance abuse and IPV, please.
Yeah, so again, that you are talking about this and you are you may be able to control the risk factors for any of us may be able to control the risk factors for IPV. Any of us might be able to, okay? When we're thinking and we're not disinhibited, not having these hyper intense emotions from substances. Once you add that to this mix, your brain can no longer do what it's supposed to do. And it's supposed to prevent you from doing this, quite frankly, because it's wrong.
Did you arrive at any conclusions concerning substance abuse and potential self-harm that may have led to Mr. Depp injuring his finger?
So I think the physician before me explained that pretty well, but I'll tell you that Mr. Depp has a history of self-injurious behavior, meaning cutting himself. Mr. Depp has a history of burning himself. I know when the actual event happened, there was texting to Dr. Kipper, paraphrasing, not saying exactly, that Amber and him got into a disagreement related to her wanting him to be sober. And then as a result of that, he said he got so angry, he cut the tip of his finger off. So if you're asking me, can someone who has, or have I seen, and can someone who cuts themselves, burns themselves, can cut a tip of their finger off with or without alcohol or cocaine or the rest? The answer is
Objection
yeah.
beyond the scope of the question.
That's exactly what he, thank you. Please
Was
continue.
it overruled?
It was overruled.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So that is not a very far jump. I've certainly seen patients do a lot worse than that who started out with similar risk factors of, burning self and cutting self. I'm not going to get into the descriptions, but I've seen people do a lot worse than that.
Okay.
So the answer is yes.
Okay. I'm going to turn now specifically to intimate partner violence, and I know you've talked certainly about it. But can you tell the jury, please, a little bit more about intimate partner violence and what is included in that?
So the APA task force on violence in the family defined more or less this topic of domestic abuse, intimate partner violence, as recurrent abusive behavior by means of psychological, sexual, or physical maltreatment for the purpose of achieving control or maintaining power, authority, and control.
Can it include threats and intimidation?
It includes, so in the part of psychological abuse, which is done essentially as a means of emotionally and mentally hurting someone, but with the same end goal to achieve control, it can be destroying property, it could be financial, which is part of that, verbal outbursts, threats, intimidation, body language, all of that goes under the concept of psychological abuse. And you may be able to divide it, verbal, nonverbal, what's exactly emotional versus verbal, but they're all under that rubric, and they're all under the guise of maintaining control.
Do survivors of intimate partner violence experience mental health issues?
Can you repeat the question?
Do survivors of intimate partner violence experience mental health issues?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So survivors of intimate partner violence, and by the way, I should start out by saying, we don't expect, in psychiatry, we don't expect our victims to be perfect. We don't expect our victims to be unscathed by what they've received. So starting with that, okay, it is not unusual as survivors to see substance use, substance abuse, substance-induced symptoms, chronic depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, or subsyndromal post-traumatic stress disorder along the lines of battered wife syndrome, and some emotional unpredictability. And again, you are a victim here. You are a victim.
Do perpetrators typically seek treatment or counseling?
No, perpetrators are not receiving counseling treatment. One, because they're going to be probably having to tell someone that they actually struck someone, which is what their thought is about the big problem, that intimate partner violence is just the hitting. Again, important, but not the sole part of it. So perpetrators very rarely will go into any type of formal counseling. Victims go into counseling. Victims are seeking actually couples counseling. Victims are seeking couples advice to try to repair what's happening. Okay? But in terms of actual perpetrators, no, they don't do that.
In your review of this case, is there record evidence of physical violence by Mr. Depp?
So
Objection, Your Honor.
Would you like to
No
approach?
foundation.
Do you want to approach on that?
So what have you reviewed that correlates with the risk factors for IPV that related to Mr. Depp?
So risk factor review that correlate, so starting with I guess we'll start with the physical because that was the question that was put out there. What I have reviewed has demonstrated pushing, shoving, grabbing.
Objection, Your Honor.
Let me see if I can direct this a little differently, Dr. Spiegel. Rather than giving the summary of what that was, what did you review that correlates? In other words, did you review witness statements? Did you review depositions, photos?
Yes. So what I reviewed was in terms of witness statements, Dr. Kipper's notes. Very, very interestingly, actually, early on in I think it was 2012, or around that time, circa 2012, 2014, Ms. Heard was...
Action beyond the scope of the question.
What he reviewed is the question.
All right, let's see.
So I reviewed so Ms. Heard's...
Objection, there's no question pending.
If he's answering, go ahead and answer what you reviewed. Please continue with what you reviewed.
Therapist's notes, counselor's notes, text messages, depositions, video, pictures, psychologists' notes and evaluations, and I said physicians' notes. That's what I reviewed.
All right. Now, you've indicated that intimate partner violence includes physical violence, sexual abuse, and psychological aggression. Can you please describe for the jury what psychological aggression is and what it entails?
So, I said psychological aggression would be the engaging in behavior for the sole purpose of emotionally and or mentally harming someone, with the main purpose of, again, to maintain control. So behaviors that can occur with psychological aggression include insults, intimidation, holding things financially against someone, jealousy rants, property destruction. So all that is involved, a nonverbal communication, so threatening looks, glances, things like that. All that is involved in psychological maltreatment and intimate partner violence.
What if anything would be psychological aggression if it was trying to control somebody's career? Would that be a factor?
Yeah,
Action leading.
Overruled.
So yeah, trying to control someone's career, that would be under financial, trying to mistreat someone, especially someone wants to succeed and try and have a career, and you're preventing them from doing so by maltreatment. That's another example.
So I'm going to ask specifically about the risk factors for intimate partner violence. Is substance abuse a risk factor for intimate partner violence?
Yes, it is a risk factor as well as a precipitating cause.
And what record evidence did you review that correlates to Mr. Depp engaging in substance abuse?
So the record evidence I'll just start with Dr. Kipper and the substances that Mr. Depp was using and misusing, both in terms of prescribed and on urine drug screen, were brought out through that.
Okay. Is lack of behavioral control and impulsiveness risk factors for intimate partner violence?
Yes, they are.
Okay. And what, if any, record evidence were you aware of that Mr. Depp had exhibited lack of behavioral control and impulsiveness?
Again, threatening,
Objection. Record evidence.
That correlates with, and I'm on the risk factors at this point. Thank you, Your Honor.
threatening, destroying furniture, property, breaking things, writings on walls, mirrors, writing in blood on furniture. All that would go with that.
Okay, all right. And what, if any, risk factor is narcissism for intimate partner violence?
So a patient, before we get into narcissistic personality traits or disorder, the overall, it's categorized under what's called cluster B personality.
Objection, Your Honor, beyond the scope of the question.
He's explaining the narcissism.
I'll sustain objection if you
Okay.
ask a question.
Can you explain to the jury what's involved with narcissism as it relates to the risk factors of intimate partner violence and
So
what that realm is?
So narcissism patients have, again, poor self-control, okay, rapid mood shifts, okay. As a result, they have an undue sense of admiration. They worship power, they worship control. They have lack of empathy, and people are generally kept around as long as they're useful to them. A large sense of entitlement. Anything else? Need for praise. So that would go under narcissistic personality and IPV.
What if any what if any traits would be requiring admiration? Would that fit into it?
Yeah, oh yes, requiring admiration, need to be admired is part and parcel of narcissistic personality disorder. Yes.
Would being envious fit within that?
Yes.
Fragile self-esteem?
Yes.
And what, if any, record evidence do you have that correlates with Mr. Depp being narcissistic?
Well, I do think that the fact that he thought that Amber owed him, Ms. Heard owed him,
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Thank you. Go ahead.
the fact that Ms. Heard owed him and only wanted to be together with him because of his fame is an example of that. I do think the jealousy aspects are an example of that. I do think, as I think Mr. Tillett had testified that, being admired is one thing, but then behind your back saying something else about people is another thing. And I can probably say with a reasonable certainty that to some degree this whole trial is that. Because
Objection, Your Honor.
What's the objection?
That's not record evidence. Speculation.
Please continue.
That this whole trial, in terms of narcissistic insult, is what's going on. I believe that Mr. Depp was very much a mainstay appropriately in Hollywood, and then this was pulled the rug without.
Objection, Your Honor. Can we
I think
be?
he's able to explain what
I'll
he's.
sustain that objection.
Can you explain what you mean by this whole trial?
This
Your Honor, can we
proceeding would go,
approach?
this court case would go.
There's an objection, sir.
What other conduct is in the record evidence that correlates with Mr. Depp being narcissistic, having those traits?
Was the thing about the trial rule, I can't
Yeah,
speak.
you're not allowed to say that.
Not say that, okay.
Okay.
The only other thing about narcissism that I think in terms of the trial would be in order to maintain any sense of control, a narcissistic person really has to have lack of empathy. Because in order to engage in behaviors that quote unquote are used to keep individuals in control, you don't really think about the other person. You're not really caring what happens to that other person. So I think that's another facet.
So are attitudes accepting or justifying intimate partner violence a risk factor for intimate partner violence?
Yes.
Do some perpetrators in intimate partner violence try to minimize the IPV?
Yes. So it is unfortunately not uncommon, especially during the calm phases of the abuse cycle where there is no increased tension, there is no acting out. Okay, you are talking about more of the honeymoon, apologetic phase, begging for forgiveness, telling them how you're going to change, maybe giving them gifts. And then when the dust settles later in the day, a day or two later, it is not uncommon for the perpetrator to kind of switch the blame over to the victim, saying that, hey, you know, this either denial, this never actually happened, and trying to make me look bad, or an allopathic defense where you instigated it, or an altruistic effect where I'm doing it for you, transformative effect, that society kind of accepts this. So it is very uncommon for all of a sudden for that to start shifting during that time, because it is during the calm phase and everything is relatively calm. This, of course, is when the victim wants to engage in treatment. But beyond that, the ability to kind of quote unquote, for lack of a better phrase, win people over, family, friends, the law. I mean, the very ability to do that is part and parcel of that calm, charming phase where it looks like the victim is, you know, just fabricating this.
And is victim blaming a characteristic?
Yes, like I said, I mean, to blame the victim, that one of the defenses are the allopathic defense comes along with victim blaming. That's what essentially you're doing. I'm blaming you for what you made me do.
Okay. And is there record evidence that you reviewed that correlates with Mr. Depp engaging in this type of behavior?
So I think for a lot of the issues seen, the big precipitant was going to be the need for sobriety. Coming back to that severe substance
Objection, Your
use.
Honor, non-responsive.
I think he's trying to explain it. Thank you. Please continue.
There's severe substance use disorder, and many of their arguments, but what I reviewed in the record, stemmed around Ms. Heard's desire for Mr. Depp to maintain sobriety, and that what was happened. So as a result, she was blamed for, you know, bothering him in a way he didn't want to be bothered, and that triggered what was going on.
Are you familiar with the term gaslighting?
I'm familiar with the term gaslighting.
Okay. What, if any, gaslighting is consistent with intimate partner violence and the risk factors?
So again, when you start being able to be, when a person starts to be able to be manipulative and charming, you start to be able to win people over, and especially when you see someone who's a victim who is essentially vulnerable, emotionally labile, okay? You see that person, and then you see this calm demeanor in front of you who is very charming, very engaging, very personable, and then all of a sudden it starts looking like the victim is just was essentially losing it, and i.e. they're being gaslighted.
Is there examples where an intimate partner violent perpetrator claims that the victim is the person who's actually committing the abuse.
Yeah, oh, yes, oh, yes.
How common is that?
That's very common. Again, that's part of that is very common in the occurrence of the honeymoon phase and the calm period of the abuse cycle. Very common during that time, where the victim, where they're shifting the blame or anything along that line. That's very common for that to happen.
And you indicated that you reviewed some audio tapes in this case, correct?
Yes.
And what, if any, evidence did you review there that correlates with Mr. Depp attempting to claim that Amber was the one?
Well, I think that was what was said, that Amber was the abuser.
Objection, Your Honor.
I don't understand the objection.
What record evidence?
Thank you. Please continue.
So that claiming that Amber was the abuser in this particular scenario. And what I will reiterate again is that, one, victims aren't perfect, and two, it is not uncommon in the context of being a victim when you know that person is about to proceed or relapsing to a substance or going to a substance and anticipating what's going to happen, that you anticipate the next mood and start initiating self-defense. But by and large, that's not what's going on here. By and large, Mr. Depp,
Objection, Your Honor.
behavior was consistent.
There's an objection, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll sustain the objection.
Okay. All right. We can move on to the next one. Is prior victimhood of abuse a risk factor for intimate partner violence?
Yes.
And
So-
go ahead.
There is something known as the intergenerational theory of violence, which is basically along the line of observation, imitation, reinforcement. So you observe a behavior that occurred in childhood, you imitate it when you see that there's no significant negative consequences, but you do get the positive consequence of maintaining control of a situation, solving the conflict in your way, if you would. So that theory is, interestingly, it applies to not only the victims, not only the perpetrators, but also the victims, because there are many victims who grow up in a house of abuse that are not abusers, but they're the victims of abuse.
What are the warning signs of intimate partner violence?
So warning signs would be increasing the tension, escalations of tension. So that's when you start seeing, hey, partners getting angry, okay, starting to break down the communication, starting to engage in verbal, nonverbal threats. Victim concedes due to this tension, and that leads you to the actual acts. So these acts progressively build, and then they occur.
What, if anything, have you seen in intimate partner violence about apologies and promises?
So again, the apology is part and parcel of the honeymoon phase, and promises are part and parcel of the honeymoon phase. And, the victim wants to believe it's going to work. They want to believe their spouse is going to be faithful to this. And as part of the abuse cycle, it ends up, as I should say, in the calming cycle, like I said, the victim tries to get some help to try to resolve this until the tension buildup phase where something bothers them. So again, it could be bothering someone about substance abuse. It can be bothering someone about finance. It could be bothering something about your career. Anything is liable to build up tension when you have this framework of limited self-control and erratic, intense mood shifts.
So what, if any, record evidence did you review that reflected Mr. Depp engaging in these warning signs, including the apologies and the promises?
I think that was almost routine, that after it was all said and done, that he would apologize for letting this monster out, letting this anger out, almost routinely. And there's very well record evidence of that starting as early on in the marriage in therapy from Ms. Heard. So that's very common and very much occurred, recognizing what happened. And the other part of this is, again, when you can recognize that when you're sober, even short-lived sobriety, when you could recognize that things are better, things are happening better, life is better, then even that should show you that, hey, there's an issue here. There are issues here that when I don't use can be resolved.
Thank you, Dr. Spiegel. I'm going to now move to the Goldwater rule. Can you explain the Goldwater rule, please?
So the Goldwater rule is when Senator Goldwater was running for presidency, and I'm going to be honest with you, I think it was in the late 60s when he was, early 70s, because I was too young to even follow politics then, so please don't quote me on exactly when it was. But basically what was happening is clinicians, psychiatrists were making these quote-unquote armchair diagnoses from their homes or offices because they saw this person on TV, the way they acted, and were asked to comment about what they think their diagnoses are. And therefore, it was felt that that should not be done by professionals in these public settings.
Does it have any applicability here?
No, it does
Objection.
not.
Why not?
No foundation.
He was explaining what the Goldwater
You
rule
want to
was.
approach?
Dr. Spiegel, do you remember the question? Does the
think the
Goldwater rule have any applicability here to your testimony and your conclusions and opinions?
No, it does not.
And
for
why?
Multiple reasons. One, the basics of expert witness testimony would almost be thrown away if you are not allowed to base things on what you evaluated of an individual, what you've read about an individual. So if I'm not allowed to comment on records or charts or information that I look, then expert witness testimony can't be done. But more specifically for this case, in the Goldwater rule, the pure version of it was the armchair diagnosis of watching someone on TV. Just, you don't make a diagnosis. More recently, I think that's even more recent, we've had examples of that. So you don't make diagnoses like that. This is not the case here, because like I said to you at the beginning, I have reviewed a lot of professionals and their evaluations and their treatment course, video deposition, picture deposition, court filings, emails. I mean, I reviewed a whole lot of things that directly describe Mr. Depp and his behavior. So I'm not commenting on a public opinion, and I have absolutely no knowledge of what's in Mr. Depp's history. If I was just doing that, it would be like watching a movie. That's not relevant here.
And in fact, I think you testified earlier, you invited Mr. Depp to.
Oh, yes.
Give an
And again-
example.
Objection leading.
Overruled.
Thank you.
So to be fair, for an evaluation, for my own direct evaluation, again, I was offered twice that I can do an evaluation of Mr. Depp directly, and both times Mr. Depp and or his lawyers decided that that wasn't going to happen.
Okay. And in fact, the court did not require Mr. Depp to.
No, and the court did not require Mr. Depp to undergo this evaluation.
Okay. Dr. Spiegel, these opinions that you have offered here, do you hold them to within a reasonable degree of medical and psychiatric probability or certainty?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, cross-examination. Thank you, Mr. Dennison.
Sir, I'm Wayne Dennison. We haven't met. But let me ask you, let's start with what you finished with.
I'm sorry, one more time?
Let's start with what you finished with. You understand that the court was twice asked by Ms. Heard's counsel to order a medical exam of Mr. Depp, and those motions were denied.
I think your team told the court you didn't want to have them, and the court ruled on them, right? I don't think the court proactively did it. You kind of had a motion to them, right?
No. When Ms. Heard's lawyers moved for them and asked for them and did not get them. Isn't that right, sir?
If you're saying that's what happened, my understanding of was that you all did not want him to undergo one. They petitioned for it. The court said no. Yes, that's what my understanding of it was.
The court said no to ordering Mr. Depp to do the medical exam.
Right, that's what I said. The court did not require it, right?
And there was one that was ordered, in fact, right?
There was,
All right.
All right, so the last thing you talked about was the Goldwater rule.
yes, sir.
Been around for almost 50 years, right?
Yeah, I'm 59. That sounds about right.
Yeah. And it's been around as a result of a presidential election that you referenced.
Yes.
And who has that rule? What organization maintains that rule?
The American Psychiatric Association.
An association you're a member of.
Associated, not a member of, yes.
Yeah. Aren't you a fellow or something?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So, and this is an ethical rule, right?
It is an ethical rule. And yes, it's ethical. They say rules. It's an ethical guideline. Yes, they're guidelines.
Mm-hmm. And you know that over time, the American Psychiatric Association has amended the rule so it's not just about diagnoses, but it's also about professional opinions.
Could you be more specific, say, about professional opinion in regard to what?
Well, let me read this and see if you're familiar with it. It is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion about an individual based on publicly available information without conducting an examination. That's the rule, right?
If you're reading it directly, I will believe you.
Okay. However, a diagnosis is not required for an opinion to be professional. So my question is, it's not just diagnosis that this Goldwater rule applies to, it's professional opinions.
So again, I'll reiterate that would come down to essentially nullifying witness testimony, expert witness testimony, without a direct evaluation. And as we know, it didn't happen. But regardless of that, the whole expert witness testimony thing would be basically rendered null and void.
The rule, in fact, contemplates that issue, doesn't it, sir?
Again, I'm just telling you the answer to the question. When you're reading me those statements, I'm telling you the response by the other side, who publishes also, is that if that was the case, there could be no expert witness testimony in the courtroom.
Psychiatrists are ethically prohibited from evaluating individuals without permission or other authorization, such as a court order. That's the rule, right?
Again, if you're reading that, then I have to believe you're not misrepresenting it. And I would come back to, again, then this whole thing on we might as well get rid of all the expert witnesses we've had throughout all of time for court proceedings. Because what you're saying is unless a court orders it, and that's what you just said, or the APA said, then therefore expert witnesses cannot do an evaluation based on an observation of the medical records. Insurance companies cannot do evaluations solely based on medical records where their doctors rendering professional opinions. So at the end of the day, you are essentially saying that unless someone has directly evaluated it, this whole medical system we have, this whole legal system we have, is null and void.
I'm not saying.
No, yes, you are, sir. No, you are.
Well, give me a second, and I'll give you more than a second. What I'm saying and what I am reading to you is a rule by your organization that takes into account that there could be court orders that would permit the exact kind of evaluation that you say I'm eliminating.
And I think we're going in circles because I think I just said that means expert witness testimony would not be allowed, and the branch of forensic psychiatry would be especially hindered. And we know the branch of forensic psychiatry does not prohibit that. So I am a member of the APA. That doesn't necessarily mean every single thing they put in there, everybody has to uncategorically agree with, because clearly that's not the case.
Did you agree in your deposition that the professional opinions you rendered were inconsistent with the Goldwater rule?
Yeah, my first is inconsistent. If we're saying that if the Goldwater rule says, and I very much said that during deposition, that the Goldwater rule was made for presidents and public figures such as that, but regardless of that, because that's what it was made for, it's not made for Hollywood. But I'll even take that Mr. Depp's a public figure. What I'm saying to you is that the Goldwater rule is saying we cannot do any expert witness testimony in our field. That is exactly what the Goldwater rule is saying based on exactly what you read. And I'm just telling you what you are saying that rule encompasses.
What I'm asking you, sir, is did you comply with the ethical requirements of the APA when rendering the professional opinions that you've rendered today?
It is a requirement of the APA. It is not the requirement of the APA. Secondarily,
so the answer is no?
Secondarily, again, in order to not, we wasted our whole morning because there was an expert witness before me. There's an expert witness everyone brought in. So all I'm saying to you, that means the whole field of medical legal law is corrupt and unethical for engaging in an act that the APA clearly says we should not do. So if you're saying that, then the answer is yes, I'm agreeing with that statement.
You're agreeing that the APA would deem your testimony and your professional opinions rendered unethical?
I'm saying you are saying that I'm an expert witness. I'm saying as an expert witness, and solely as an expert witness, that guideline is permitting that from occurring. I would say then that the whole field of expert witness testimony, again, would be disavowed by what you are quoting in the Goldwater rule. And we know that's not the case, because if it was, we would not be allowed to do it.
And you said the rule was for presidents, right? And
that was
public
initially
figures.
for presidents, yes.
Well, and the name of the rule came from that. But the rule says it is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion about an individual. That's right, sir. It's not just presidents, it's not public figures, it's individuals.
Funny, it was named after according to your logic, if you don't put something in the title, it's not true. That's what you told me this morning, I believe, at my intimate partner violence. So what I would say to you then, sir, is that if you say this about an individual, again, any court would have to render an expert witness testimony invalid. Any doctor that reviews charts would have to render it invalid. I can go on the list of docs that do not see or interview patients directly, and that's a violation. So basically, you are saying that unless you do a direct clinical evaluation, then all of the field of forensic psychiatry and all of managed care is doing an unethical violation because we are not seeing the presence. We deny patients medications all the time without seeing them. We deny patients treatments, unfortunately, without seeing them. And I'm on the receiving end of that. So the answer to your question, again, unless you are saying to me that all of this is unethical, which is what you are saying. This is how I'm interpreting what you are saying to me. That unless you do the evaluation directly yourself, therefore, it could not be considered ethical. And I'm telling you how that's applicable to not just expert law, but also managed care. It's applicable to multiple branches of medicine. Hospital duration of hospitalization stay, they get evaluated. So tell me where you want me to end this.
Well,
Sir.
why don't we talk about what you just testified to? Because I didn't ask you anything about that. I asked you whether, under this rubric, under this principle of medical ethics, have you acted unethically? Yes or no?
No. As an expert witness, I have not acted unethically. And if you want the jury to believe that expert witnesses are unethical, then I guess that's for them to decide.
Yes or
that's
no,
for them
sir.
to
You
decide.
said no. Let's go to the next question.
Okay.
Right? Psychiatric diagnosis occurs in the context of an evaluation based on thorough history-taking examination and where applicable collated or collateral information. You'll agree with that?
I believe I said that earlier, yes.
Yeah. And it's a departure from the methods of the profession to render an opinion without an examination and without conducting an evaluation in accordance with the standards of psychiatric practice, correct?
Well, again, by the way, for the record, intimate partner violence is not a psychiatric diagnosis. I'll start with that. Substance usage by themselves is not a psychiatric diagnosis. If you want to cut to the chase, psychiatry is not a diagnosis of that. Narcissistic personality traits is not a diagnosis. Ergo, I am basically commenting on the things that were brought to me, which are not diagnosis. But an evaluation, if I was going to treat a patient or anyone here, those are the steps I would take.
We, I think, started with the notion that this rule applies broader than diagnoses. It applies to professional opinions.
I believe
and
you
you've
just
rendered
quoted
professional opinions relative to narcissistic personality traits, haven't you, sir? Relative to Mr. Depp.
Again, I believe you just commented on what it takes to do in a psychiatric evaluation to establish a diagnosis. I'm almost certain that's what you said. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you didn't say that, but I'm sure you did. And therefore, what I'm saying is neither IPV nor substance usage nor narcissistic personality traits a psychiatric diagnosis. And then under the rubric of expert witness testimony, you are saying I acted unethically under the rubric of expert witness testimony. So if you, sir, would like to proceed that expert witnesses are unethical, based on that, I am not going to sit here and disagree with you and waste everyone's time. I think it's fairly obvious. So thank you. I'll go ahead. These were your words. I'm just saying them back how they're interpreted.
Okay. Let's start with the easy question then. Maybe we can.
That was pretty easy. Go ahead.
All right, Doctor, you're going to have to just answer the questions.
Okay. Sorry about that. I haven't getting into it.
You need to just answer the questions,
Okay.
Dr. Spiegel.
You are not rendering any diagnosis whatsoever of Mr. Depp today or ever.
No, I probably would say to you that certainly I would not say narcissistic personality, or I would say traits. Certainly from what I have read, intimate partner violence is not a diagnosis. So the answer is no for that. Narcissistic personality traits is not a diagnosis. The answer is no. But if you want to tell me that substance use disorder is a psychiatric diagnosis, the answer is yes.
But that wasn't an issue, was it? Whether Mr. Depp used substances? I mean, you said you've gone through the record. That wasn't really an issue at this trial. He's said it from day one.
Oh, so you're saying he's already admitted to the diagnosis?
He's already admitted to the use of the substances.
Well, again, there's a difference between admitting to substance use and substance use disorder.
Let's go back to what you just said about narcissistic personality traits.
Yes.
Narcissistic personality disorder is a DSM-5 diagnosis, correct?
Correct.
Diagnostic personality, and you haven't testified that Mr. Depp has narcissistic personality disorder, have you?
I would certainly, if I didn't, I'm certainly thinking that, but at least I'm going to say he has traits which are characteristics of provisional diagnosis of, it's a provisional diagnosis of probably narcissistic personality disorder. But yeah, I mean, I do believe that.
Well, but when you say provisional diagnosis, you know the DSM-5 requires, in order to find that diagnosis, 5 of the 9 factors. Mm-hmm. And you haven't done that analysis. You've never made that diagnosis. You've just identified certain factors.
That are criteria for the diagnosis.
Right. But you need 5 of 9 to get to the diagnosis. You've already told us that you didn't make a diagnosis. You're just identifying traits, correct?
I'm identifying traits that are consistent with the diagnosis, yes. Which narcissistic personality disorder is part of, is a huge risk factor for intimate partner violence, which include, cluster B traits include narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, amongst others. So the answer to the question is every resource on intimate partner violence will support that cluster B traits where narcissistic personality falls under is a risk factor for intimate partner violence.
Any single trait is a risk factor for IPV.
Again, I will repeat, cluster B traits. I didn't say any trait. I said cluster. No,
Let me be more precise then.
Okay.
Any narcissistic trait in and of itself is a risk factor for IPV.
But you are mischaracterizing what I said. What I said, I'm pretty sure I said cluster, if you look at all the intimate partner violence literature, and I would behoove you to do so, you will see that cluster B traits, I didn't say narcissistic per se, cluster B traits, where narcissistic personality disorder is part of, are risk factors for intimate partner violence, part and parcel uniformly true. And I'm not sure, the thing I don't understand is, I'm not sure why we're arguing psychiatry, because I'm telling you what it is.
Dr. Siegel, you just need to answer the question.
Okay.
So you want to talk about cluster B, so let's do that for a minute. Borderline personality disorder is a risk factor for IPV.
As part of cluster B traits, yes.
Histrionic personality disorder is a risk factor for IPV.
Less so.
But it
Less so.
good.
Less so.
It's
I mean,
cluster B.
it's a risk factor, but less so, yes.
Yeah.
Less so. Significantly less so.
All right. So which traits under narcissistic, before I move on there, there's only been one diagnosis in court of personality disorders, correct?
I'm not sure who you're referring to. Are you referring to Mr. Depp, Ms. Hurt? I'm not sure what you were talking about.
Do you understand that there was a medical examination done of Ms. Hurt?
Yes, I did.
Do you understand that the testimony was ultimately that Ms. Hurd suffers from 2 personality disorders?
Okay, so I'm just being specific. I just wanted to know if you're talking about Ms. Hurt or Mr. Depp. So that's all I was asking you.
Yes or no to my question?
Which was there's only one diagnosis of, Ms. Hurd was diagnosed with that.
Yeah, and both of the diagnoses are in cluster B, and both of them are risk factors for IPV.
But both those cluster B things are, I'm not allowed to comment on the testing, so therefore, all I can say is that cluster B traits, and I'll tell you what they are, and by the way, I testified this before, which was that, 1, I don't expect perfection from my victims. 2, absolutely there were cluster B traits Ms. Hurd had. Absolutely Ms. Hurd had cluster
Given that
B.
you've testified to it before, let's move on to a new question.
Okay.
All right? You indicated, in your opinion today, that you thought, well, why don't we move a little differently? Are you a member of the American Medical Association?
No.
Okay, so you don't know what the ethical rule of the American Medical Association is relative to doing clinical diagnoses about individuals you've never talked to.
So you're saying in terms of doing expert witness evaluations, under that rubric, right?
I'm just asking you, do you know the AMA's rule?
You're saying the AMA's ruling under the rubric of not doing evaluation, some of you did not see, and I'm questioning, I'm asking, so you are talking about expert witness testimony?
No, I'm talking about, do you know the rule?
I'm not a member of the AMA, so I don't
Okay, great.
read the rubric.
We can move on. You don't know the rule.
Huh?
All right. You rendered an opinion about Mr. Depp's purported cognitive impairment.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you use as a baseline?
A baseline for processing speed?
Yeah, for analyzing Mr. Depp before you watched his deposition.
What do I use a baseline for that?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess my baseline would probably be how I've seen him interact in public. How I've seen him interact with others. I've seen him interact in media. I've seen him interact and his process speed is certainly not slow. I've seen him do commercials. His process speed was not slow.
At deposition, didn't you say that what you did was compare Mr. Depp's performance in lots of pirate movies against his deposition testimony here?
What I said was I've seen Mr. Depp do apology ads. I remember he did an apology ad with Bad Dog with no delay in process speed. I've seen him interact with the media regarding to that. I saw no delay in processing speed. All I'm saying
Let me ask you about pirates, though. You compared pirates to the to the depositions given in this case.
Then I apologize for what I said. Then I misspoke.
You misspoke? You didn't make the comparison?
Right now, just a second ago? Just a second ago, I may have said that I misspoke. I apologize, I misspoke.
Okay. Because you know you can't compare pirates to sworn testimony, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But you can, but as an aside, you can judge someone's processing speed at any time. Like, I'm judging yours right now, you're judging mine. We all judge processing speed as a baseline because of what we know about each other. And I would say your processing speed right now is not slow. So, I mean, we're judging processing speed. I'm just saying to you.
Yeah. But no, any of Mr. Depp's other portrayals in movies, did that affect your analysis of processing speed?
Only I've seen him interact on interviews, and that was it.
Right.
When he wasn't in movies.
Right. But Willy Wonka doesn't matter to you? You see him in that movie, Charlie and Chocolate Factory? Did you look at that one when you were comparing his processing speed?
Do I have to answer that question, Your Honor?
You have to answer questions. Yes, sir.
No, you'll be happy to know I didn't see Willy Wonka I didn't see 21 Jump Street when it happened, or whatever it was about. No, I did not.
All right. You made a very kind admission, I think, early on in your deposition, that you're not claiming to be a better actor than Mr. Depp. That's correct, isn't it?
100%.
All right. But with respect to acting, you know that actors actually rehearse for their parts and work on the language, diction, timing of their dialogue as part of that rehearsal?
If you say that, I'm not an actor, so I don't know what goes on. I can't tell you. I have no idea what goes on in acting.
Okay. But you don't know enough about acting to know whether actors rehearse?
Sir, I am not an expert in acting. I have no idea what an actor does.
Okay. During your deposition, what were the circumstances under which you decided to call Mr. Depp an idiot?
Under somebody call Mr. Depp an idiot?
Yeah, you called Mr. Depp an idiot in your deposition. Why
Okay. So I think it was in the context. I think it was in the, probably should read the context of it, because I think the context was, and I'm trying to think back, okay? And what I thought it was related to was if you're coming to some deposition, okay? And again, I'm thinking back, so you have it in front of you. I don't. So I'm thinking back where he's coming in from Europe for a deposition, video deposition that he gave, and he took an overnight the night before. And what I think I said was that if you're going to do a major thing to a trial that you're involved with, I think you'd be an idiot to come in the night before.
All right.
So I didn't call Mr. Depp an idiot. I certainly called that planning an idiot. I didn't call him an idiot.
So the words, so I mean he's an idiot, are mistranscribed?
No, I'm sure, again, if I said it in that, if you're just reading one line, one snippet, I'm sure it was in the context I just said. But again, you have it in front of you, I don't.
Yeah. Is idiot a professional opinion?
I wasn't rendering professional opinion,
Yeah.
no.
Is it a psychiatric opinion?
And that follows the Goldwater rule.
How does it follow the?
Well, you just said that I'm not rendering a professional opinion. I just said idiot. That's not a Goldwater.
So idiot is not a professional opinion? Mm-hmm. Is it your practice to describe people as idiots?
My practice describe people, in my practice? No, I don't describe people my clinical cases as idiots or patients as idiots or victims as idiots. No, sir.
But you sat for a deposition in this case and described the plaintiff as an idiot, correct?
You gave me 9 hours of deposition, and if I said the word idiot, it was an idiot in planning. It wasn't making him an idiot. I don't know Mr. Depp's IQ. I don't know his overall functioning. So therefore, if I said it, it was an idiot in planning, which is what I meant to come across as.
All right. So you did say you don't know his overall functioning, but you made some testimony today as to some evaluations you made relative to his functioning. You would agree with me that it's probably a good idea to think about the questions that are asked you in a court proceeding before answering them.
Am I allowed to answer that question?
Yes.
Okay. So What I meant by function, what I said by function, I believe that his agent reported how late he was showing up to every movie while the cast is waiting for him. I believe that would be an impairment. If I showed up late for that, I would not be here right now, would not have a job, okay? I believe the thing was in terms of balking out of treatment for substance rehab that his doctor is prescribing for him. So if you're asking me if that's an impairment of functioning, I would say I'm very much substantiated in that.
I'm trying to understand how you got to this notion of cognitive decline. And I thought it was based at least in part on the manner in which he testified.
I'm sorry, what?
On the manner in which he testified.
On the manner, I'm sorry, I'm not being difficult, I can't hear, I'm sorry, on what?
I was asking you about the cognitive decline
Yes.
testimony that you made.
Yes.
And it was my understanding that at least a portion of that testimony that you rendered was that you derived some evidence of cognitive decline from the way Mr. Depp testified.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's what I said, yes.
Right. And so all I'm asking you is, don't you think it's a good idea when you're in the middle of a court proceeding to answer questions carefully?
Again, professionally, we diagnose patients with a neurocognitive disorder by gross evaluation all the time with cognitive. On the thought that, again, age normal controls, I'm just saying, age normative controls does not put a 58-year-old gentleman at that processing. That's all I'm saying. That's
Right.
all I said.
And you derived this without ever once talking to the man.
Me directly talking to him. Because we know how I derived it. So you're talking about me directly talking to him?
Yeah, you never talked.
No, I've never talked to him.
Right. And this exam you gave, well, you did talk about Dr. Blaustein, right?
Yes, sir.
And you understand that the entirety of Dr. Blaustein's medical records are 12 pages of handwritten notes.
The important part was what I said. For me, as an example of cognition, which I'm trying to prove, which is what you asked me, the important part was what I said. And that was irrefutable.
The important part is that he gave the mini mental status exam?
Yes, sir.
All right.
That's
Let's
a
talk
cognitive-
about the mini mental status exam. Scored on a 30-point scale, right?
Yes.
All right. And it's an exam that basically is most often used for, Alzheimer's, dementia, those kind of testing?
It's an exam that tests cognition in all psychiatric illnesses, not just Alzheimer's. It was made for dementia for Alzheimer's, but is the standard, has been the standard for testing cognition in all psychiatric illness, substance use disorders included.
Okay. Now, there is an element of that exam that requires drawing, correct?
Yes.
So you don't know what drawing Mr. Depp did or whether the drawing should have been fully scored.
I wasn't questioning his visual spatial perceptual skills, which is what that does.
Right. And you don't know what score Mr. Depp received on the exam.
I was very specific. I know 3 words, not remembering at 5 minutes. That's all I said.
3 words, not remembering 5 minutes, and he remembered one of them, right?
From what I understand, you didn't remember any of them.
All right. Memory on the exam, out of the 30 points, what's it worth? 3. 3, right? Memory is 3 out of the 30.
Yeah, memory's 3.
Okay.
But again, the memory section in and of itself tests memory. That's the only question that tests memory, only section that actually tests memory.
So the memory section tests memory. It's the only section you testified about. And for all you know, that with respect to the exam that you're relying on, Mr. Depp scored 27 out of 30.
And that would be telling, though, cognitive, if you score 27 out of 30 and you miss 3 points on memory. That would be very telling.
You don't know if Mr. Depp had been up all night the night before.
Again, you wouldn't expect to not recall any words at 3 minutes unless there's a cognitive issue.
You don't know if Mr. Depp was high.
And again, now if that's, again, now that could affect memory, but I'm not refuting that. I'm not refuting that at all. He could have been high, he could have been drunk, he could have been using cocaine, and that would absolutely affect his memory, which is what I said. Yes, you're right.
So ultimately, you have no idea what state Mr. Depp was in at the time he took the exam that you're relying on.
Short of what you just said about drugs and alcohol, okay, there shouldn't be a reason why a 58-year-old also with strokes and other neurocognitive conditions, but short of that, there shouldn't be a really good reason why someone at that age shouldn't come up with at least one. But an answer,
But wait a minute, you started that question with short of drugs and alcohol and spent 35 minutes talking about his use of drugs and alcohol. Isn't that right?
oh, I'm agreeing. I thought I agreed with you. I think I agreed. I said that drugs and alcohol can absolutely affect cognition. I'm not sure. Yeah, I agree, but I'm not sure if that's a problem. I agree with you on that.
All right. So you don't know, one way or the other, how he scored on the exam. You don't know whether he was at the time on drugs and alcohol, but you're going to rely on it in your testimony to say that he's cognitively impaired.
Which is what we do in clinical medicine, sir.
Okay. You rely on tests that you don't know when it was administered, you don't know the score of the test, and you don't know the state of the person being tested, but you're going to rely on it anyway.
Again, if we had to know every test, when people get the mini-mental state exam, we have no idea clinically if they are high, wasted, stoned, stroke. We have no idea. So if you're going to say that, that means everybody needs a drug test before they do a mini-mental study, and that's not the standard of care. And I think you know that. So
let's talk a little bit about this word you kept using, correlation. You know the word, right?
yes,
Correlation and causation aren't the same thing, are they, sir?
correlation. No, they're not the same thing.
No. How are they different?
Correlation is consistent with causation, is direct link.
Can you say that again? You were so fast I didn't hear it.
I'm sorry about that. Correlation is a risk for something happening. Causation is a direct link.
Right. So just because something's correlated doesn't mean it's going to happen.
100%.
Right.
100%.
Like lung cancer, for instance. Smoking is very highly correlated with lung cancer, right?
Yeah, and there's certainly a link
Right.
to lung cancer and smoking.
Right. But not all smokers get lung cancer.
Not all smokers do. No one, like I said, no one fits the curve perfectly.
Right. And you made repeated testimony to all of us. All of us do this. All of us do that. Mm-hmm. Your suggestion about all of us is you're just looking at the world as a sample and not at any particular individual, correct?
What I'm looking at is that I am not talking about an individual, how they can or cannot be resistant. What I'm saying is invariably, when you use substances, this is going to happen. Now, is there a 0.05% chance that someone who does? Absolutely there is. But is that medical degree of certainty? Absolutely not.
A 0.05% chance of what, sir?
Of eventually developing symptoms. If you're using excessively, eventually you're going to develop symptoms.
All right. But risk factors tell us nothing about any one particular individual, do they, sir?
No. Again, risk factors tell us nothing except that they have it, they're at a higher likelihood of developing it. That's
Right.
what it tells us.
But you did a whole litany of risk factors relative to IPV.
Yes.
Right. And none of those risk factors tell us anything specifically about an individual.
Other than they're at higher risk. Right.
Right. So someone could have every single risk factor for IPV and never commit IPV, right?
It would be, again, if you're going to say a medical degree of probability, the answer is They will, but if you're saying uniformly, the answer is no.
Right. IPV can occur without substance abuse.
Oh, sure.
Someone can abuse substances without ever perpetrating IPV.
Again, absolutely. But, again, you are saying, different than what I said, I did not say abusing substance. I said substance use disorder. Those are two different things, because there are surely people who use substances that do not engage in any violence, do not become psychotic, nothing at all. So
And that's
absolutely.
equally true of people who have substance abuse disorder. There are certainly people who have substance abuse disorder who don't commit IPV, correct?
They are saying people who have substance use disorders, the majority of them, over 50% do. So over 50% do. So that's medical agreement.
The answer is yes.
As you said, not everyone who smokes gets lung cancer.
So there are significant numbers of people. You said it was over 50, so you'd say 40% of the people who have substance abuse disorder don't commit IPV?
And those are the ones that do not have IPV risk factors, right? So we're talking about people
Wait a
who
minute,
don't.
isn't substance abuse disorder and IPV risk factor?
Oh, yeah. These are other people that don't have other risk factors, right?
Right. But again, we're talking about people in general. You don't know anything about any particular individual as to whether anybody's going to commit IPV.
If statistics follow through, all we can say is more than 50%, 70% will. If you combine more risk factors you have, the more likely you're going to develop the illness. If you smoke cigarettes once, that might not correlate to lung cancer. If you smoke it chronically, that might. So
Right,
that's
but
all I'm
we're
saying.
talking about individuals here. You either have lung cancer or you don't, right?
If you're smoking.
Right.
Right.
You either commit IPV or you didn't.
Oh, I mean, yeah, you either did or you didn't, yes.
Right. So you took some issue with me because I was asking about substance abuse generally, and you wanted me to talk about the disorder. I asked you earlier about narcissistic personality disorder, and you haven't made that diagnosis. You've just talked about the traits, right?
Yes.
And somebody can have these narcissistic personality traits and substance abuse disorder and never commit IPV, right?
So, along that line,
Right.
about 80 to 90% of people who commit IPV have a personality disorder. So the answer is less than about 10% obviously do not.
Right. There are more close links with IPV for borderline personality disorder than narcissistic personality disorder. Correct, sir?
I'm not going to agree with that.
No?
I'm not saying there are more links. I would say to you there are absolute. If you're asking me if there are links, the answer is absolutely. If you're saying to me more, I can show studies say yes, so studies say that. That has not been absolutely definitively correlated. No.
No.
Absolutely not.
MDMA. What is it?
Ecstasy.
Yeah. And what's the normal dosage of ecstasy for people who use ecstasy?
Again, I couldn't tell you the quote-unquote normal dose because, honestly speaking, no one knows what they're getting when they're using it, right? It's not regulated, so.
But the effects of ecstasy enhance sense of well-being?
At low doses, the answer is yes. I'm going to gather when you're using it at higher doses and develop tolerance, you develop the sympathomimetic effects, which are not so enhanced well-being.
Increased extroversion, that's a symptom?
Again, At low doses, you are 100% right. At low amounts, you are 100% right. It is an entactogen. We feel closer to people. That's what people who use it say. They feel close to people, warmth to people, 100%. But with continual use and higher doses, it could be fatal.
Right.
So that's not well-being. I don't know if I call that well-being.
So continued use at higher doses, MDMA can be fatal, correct?
Correct.
What if you took 8 to 10 tablets of MDMA?
What if you took again, you don't know what it's very hard to say that. You don't know what it's, what's the word I'm looking for? Contaminated with, okay? You can't just say, hey, let me just take 8 to 10 pure ecstasy and see what happens. That's not gonna happen. So what I would say to you, again, because substance abuse are unpredictable, they are not regulated, no one knows what they're going to. No one has any idea whether it's going to cause this empathic entactogen effect at very low doses, or is it going to cause the sympathomimetic, increase, it's like a stimulant, like cocaine and something we talked about like that. No one knows what's going to happen. It's not regulated. And no one knows if you're using with other substances either, like other stimulants.
Or if you mix it with alcohol?
Or if you mix it with alcohol. No one knows if it's going to be potentially worse.
Right. But this is a potentially lethal combination, 8 to 10 MDMA tablets and alcohol.
This is a potentially toxic combination.
Right.
Can it kill you? Yeah, I mean, it is a potentially toxic combination. That's true.
Ever heard of someone cutting off their own finger on MDMA?
Have I ever heard of it?
Yeah.
No, I can only give you one example.
Hadn't seen that one before. Okay.
I
So, Seroquel. That one puts you to sleep, right?
If you want to phrase a barbiturate putting you to sleep, then the answer is yes.
Yeah, you heard Mr. Depp talking about sometimes being on the nod, right?
And again, I think I explained Seroquel very well this morning.
Good. I'm going to ask him a few more questions.
Oh, okay. Okay.
All right. You kept making references to street value. Why were you doing that?
Because that's why people with substance use disorder use quetiapine and Seroquel.
Say it again, I'm sorry.
That's why people who use quetiapine or Seroquel it sells on the street because it's so barbiturate-like in effect.
Right, but you said that Mr. Depp had a prescription.
There are many substance use disorder patients who have prescriptions for Adderall and quetiapine from their doctor, and that doesn't mean they're not getting high out of it. That doesn't take much. Doctors like to believe what patients have to say. They're not going to go in there being expert witness testimony. All I'm telling you is that in people who have substance use disorder, it is not uncommon, and the thought was initially that because quetiapine was not addicting, that it's safe to give in people with substance use disorders, when in fact, we absolutely know it has street value. We absolutely know that for a fact.
Right, but my point about this is you made a bunch of testimony about street value, but you knew at the time you made the testimony that Mr. Depp, in fact, had a prescription.
He also had a prescription for oxycodone and roxicodone. Does that count? Because that's also probably not a good thing. Just because you have a prescription doesn't mean that...
I think Mr. Depp would agree with you it wasn't a good thing.
Just because you have a prescription doesn't mean you can't abuse it.
No, I'm not suggesting you're abusing it. I'm just wondering why your testimony was in any way tied to street value when every single drug you referenced, Mr. Depp had legally.
Again, you can have prescription substance abuse, and we know that, correct? No, I shouldn't be asking that. We can have prescription substance use disorders, and that's not uncommon if you look at the opiate epidemic that we're living in right now. We can have that. That's not an uncommon thing. Unfortunate, but uncommon. Not uncommon.
So, Seroquel, I think you described as a sleeping agent when used off-label?
When I saw what?
Sleeping agent, Seroquel, when used off-label?
When used off-label, it's used. It can be used sleeping agent, yes.
Right. So, Mr. Depp's use of Seroquel could account for some of the photos we saw in this trial, where he's asleep in a chair?
Again, what I would say to you is that if you have a substance use disorder, You are using it to be knocked out. Yes, I agree. But I'm not sure at the end of the day if she'd have vomitus over you either, because I've never seen Sarah Will do that. So when he was passed out in the chair, he also had vomitus over him. I've never seen Sarah Will do that ever.
Neurontin is another one of the drugs you testified about. That one's also prescribed, right?
Yes, it is.
And what's the prescription for that?
What's it used for? And what's its indication, or what's its used
What's
for?
its indication?
I mean, its indication is for seizures. It may have one pain indication. Again, I'm not a neurologist, so I can't tell you exactly if it does. But it's chronically used off-label for pain. It's used off-label for anxiety.
Right. And what's its effect? That's another one that'll put you to sleep, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, sure, 100%.
Right. And you made reference to a picture. There's been testimony around that picture that Mr. Depp fell asleep with ice cream in his hand. That's not vomitous, right?
I was told it was vomitous.
Okay. You talked about the fact that Mr. Depp indicates that from time to time he uses an earpiece.
I read that, yes.
Okay. Did you read the testimony of Mr. Wyatt, who told you what was being pumped into that earpiece?
Yeah, I mean, if I remember right, I mean, I think it was lines, right?
No, it was music.
It was music, not his line?
Yeah.
Okay.
So if Mr. Depp was listening to music rather than being fed his lines, does that change your opinion as to his cognitive function?
If he was never fed his lines through the earpiece, which I know he was, but read he was, and that may have been that example, Mr. Wyatt may have said that it was music. I guess the question is, were you having the music during the actual talking of your lines? Is that what you're saying to me?
Well, you know, if you can do two things at once, that's a pretty high cognitive function, isn't it, sir?
You know, it's a very good point, actually. Divided attention is something humans have a lot of trouble in. So, for instance, we have trouble driving and putting on using our cell phones and direct. So, divided attention, humans actually are not very good at. I'll put that out there.
But Mr.
In general, not just Mr. Depp. In general.
But Mr. Depp is pretty good at acting. You acknowledge that early on.
Absolutely. Well, better than me, so I know that.
Because you don't act. In fact, you don't know about acting.
You're right. I have no idea about acting.
And you don't know how prevalent the use of earpieces are in acting.
Again, I know nothing about acting.
Irrespective of the fact you know nothing about acting, you've testified that Mr. Depp's use of an earpiece is somehow a cognitive deficit?
So if I was giving a lecture and I was fed my lines, I would think there's a cognitive deficit. So and maybe I'm wrong. Like I said, maybe I could be wrong. Maybe Hollywood stars get lines fed to them through earpieces all the time, and I don't know. That could be said. It sounded to me to be unusual if you're doing a movie and you don't know the lines. But like you said, I'm just judging what I do with lectures, and that would never happen.
If you gave lectures, you wouldn't use an earpiece, but you're not going to tell anybody how to act.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I said if you gave lectures, you wouldn't use an earpiece, but you're not telling anybody how to act.
Right, I would not use an earpiece during lectures.
Right.
But I don't know what the standard for standard as Hollywood is for that. I have no idea.
Your testimony about the use of an earpiece, as maybe you were wrong. You're comfortable with the fact that you may have made a mistake there?
No, because I think in the basis of what I've read about it, I'm comfortable that I don't believe that actors are routinely given their entire script through earpieces. I find that hard to believe.
Yeah,
but
and there's not one whit of evidence that this ever happened here.
I guess what I said. I just said I find it hard to believe. I didn't say it. I said I find it hard to believe. That's all I said.
Oh, yeah, but what you found hard to believe, sir, was that every line of the script was pumped through an earpiece. Where did you ever get the idea that that occurred?
That's what I have been, that's what I read in the court review, the court evidence. That's where I got it from.
And you know whether Marlon Brando used an earpiece?
Whether, isn't he dead?
Yeah.
So the answer is no, he does not use one now.
Oh, no, I used the past tense. Sir.
Oh, I'm sorry. I know nothing, I will concede to you, I know nothing about acting. I will concede to you 100%. If that is the standard and people are done that's acting, then I apologize and that was wrong on my part. If that's the standard, I'm wrong. I don't know.
Okay. Let's go with that. No further questions.
All right. How long is your return?
A bit, you may want to take.
All right, let's go ahead and break for lunch then, ladies and gentlemen. Again, do not do any outside research. Do not discuss your testimony with anybody, okay? All right. So let's come back at 1:55 then. All right. Is that fine? I think 1:55.
All right.
Come on down.